I'm sure we've all had those series we've been weirdly into and weirdly obsessed with at some point in our lives. I've had many. I have a very wide range of reading interests, and even the books that I read and didn't particularly like The Hunger Games, and series with massive social issues, like Twilight, have something interesting to me in them somewhere, which will no doubt lead to some kind of obsession. Did you know about the Twilight Renaissance in COVID? How about thousands of years worth of Quarter Quell ideas and the political manipulation of the Capitol? I have a problem where there are so many things I'm interested in reading that I just pick up tons of books. Whether they be at a bookshop, secondhand, or from our street library, I've collected a lot of books. And in high school, although I did read, I didn't read nearly as much as I should have. Me being addicted to Overwatch and later to Going 17. Hence, they all piled up. Hence, I needed to get rid of them somehow. This year, I've been pretty good at it. I've read 32 books at time of writing and have donated them to the community after reading. Keeping only the most special of books and mangas has helped me consolidate my bookshelf and clear out 2 whole shelves. Woo! Which gives more space for K-pop and journaling stuff. Whoops. Anyway, as part of this clear out, I've revisited a few books that I previously read to see if I still wanted to keep them, and 2 of these books were a past obsession of mine, The Duology of Disruption and Corruption by Jessica Shervington. Disruption and Corruption are interesting books, to say the least, and my relationship with them is also interesting. I was gifted Disruption for my birthday in 2014 by a friend. The version I received has the classic full gold cover. Now, the only book I had ever seen with a gold cover before was my father's wine list book, so I had a very disappointed reaction to this gift, assuming that freshly 11-year-old me had just been given a wine book, and thus probably offending my friend and her mother. But I did read it once I realised it was an actual book, and I was instantly obsessed with it. Once I finished the first one, I begged my mum to get me the second, and when I had it, I was so glued to it that I finished it in a day and literally sat at the back of another friend's party, rudely reading away. I don't know why anyone didn't criticise me for that. Can you tell that younger me didn't have much in the way of social skills? Anyway, I loved the duology so much that I read it countless times over the following few years, before relegating the books to a small bookshelf in the corner of my room and forgetting about them until March of this year, when I decided to try them out again. And I had so much fun rereading these books. I finished the 2 of them in about a day each and dropped almost everything else to read them. Was I actually glued to the plot? Of course not, I already knew what was happening, and they aren't a literary masterpiece either, but I was having huge amounts of fun just reliving my childhood love of the books and gaining a new appreciation for them as an adult with more worldly experience and more reading experience, and finding out how devious they are. In fact, I enjoyed rereading them so much that I wanted to make this video to tell you all about this incredibly unknown but interesting duology. In this video, I'll talk about the history of the duology and about the author Jessica Shervington, and then we'll run you through the plot of both books. Then I'll discuss my own thoughts on the books, both good and bad, and then we'll take a look at the Goodreads reviews for said books, since I noticed some interesting ones. Trigger warning for this video. These books include copious amounts of emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and abuse, and also the obvious things you'd find in many books, especially YAs. Death, grievous injury, suicide, that kind of thing. Oh, also, the books include class warfare, a horribly corrupt and abusive prison system, dehumanization, and what I think is a very poorly concealed Holocaust allegory, so you've been warned. And yes, that is kind of an insane warning. Alright, so why those warnings? Well, first let's talk about what disruption and corruption are and the history of them and their author. Disruption is the first book of a YA dystopian romance duology, the second book of which is called Corruption. These books are written by an Australian author, Jessica Shervington, who was born in Sydney on the 15th of April 1979. Shervington has actually written many other books, the most well-known of which is the Embrace series, which I've actually never read, even though it was, I'm pretty sure, available in my primary school library. Anyway, Disruption was published on the 1st of April 2014, and the sequel Corruption was published on the 20th of October 2014. A very quick turnaround. Shervington has an Instagram account which she posts very sporadically on, and has a website which no longer seems to actually exist. Anyway, looking at her Instagram account, it looks like Disruption was published in America in 2016, and she posted several reviews from readers as well as a picture from an American con in which Blue State authors discussed the rise of authoritarianism. Interesting, but this isn't quite as odd as it sounds, because even though Shervington is Australian, Disruption and Corruption are set in America and very Americanized, which is odd. Oh, speaking of, Disruption got this new cover for the US release, which is just kinda, ugh, I don't like it. I think the original cover with barcodes nicely expresses how we humans are just products in the world of the book. Anyway, the tagline of the book is "Sacrifices must be made," which Shervington also showed off on printed badges, and if you listen to the rest of this video, you'll understand why that's a questionable tagline, to say the least. In more questionable choices, Shervington made this post in October 2016, where her book was featured by HarperCollins with the text, quote, "That feeling when you fall in love with a book boyfriend for the first time. Two of our swooniest dudes live in these pages." Which makes me almost physically nauseous. You'll find out more if you keep listening, but for now, let me just say that Quentin has been through enough, and this high schooler does not need to be swooned over by teenage girls and grown women alike. Ugh. One last fun fact. Shervington also wrote a book called Between the Lives, which I've also read and enjoyed as a kid, which follows a girl called Sabine who switches between two lives at midnight every day. Between the Lives was published in 2013, and in the US release is called One Past Midnight, which I just thought was interesting. It's definitely a very interesting concept, but it also has some questionable aspects, like medical staff/psych patient romances. Oh dear. Alright, so with that said, let's talk about Disruption. What is it actually about? Please forgive my awkward photos of my copy of the book. Disruption begins, quote, 3 weeks ago, with the opening line, "I'd been tracking him for most of the day," followed by, "I had other things to do, but it had been over a month since I'd monitored his weekend activity, and sloppiness wasn't an option now." Okay, so a relatively interesting opening, right? Who is him? Why are we monitoring him? And why is it particularly important now? Well, you can probably answer all of these questions yourself if you've read the synopsis, but I honestly hadn't. And since I'd always been told the point of the opening of the book is to get people interested and to make them ask questions which keep them going, well, this isn't the best opening in the world, but it's still pretty decent. We find out that the person our main character, Maggie, is shadowing has ditched his driver for the day for no discernible reason other than perhaps to try and fail to blend in with the plebs. Okay, I'm already sick of this. The person we're following is Quentin, who, spoiler alert, is in my opinion by far the best, most likable and most well-developed character in this book. Anywho, apparently Quentin's family are all Princeton graduates, but he's been checking out another uni behind his dad's back. This is one of the issues the book has that's a YA issue. Although overall the prose was far better than I thought it would be on reread, it does have the tendency to tell, not show. And the fact that Quentin is exploring a different uni, thus maybe, just maybe, is a tad rebellious, is borderline shoved in our faces. Speaking of, there's this line, quote, "Standing there in his waist-hugging suit pants and waywardly untucked white shirt, he simply had no need to see me." Thanks, so we now know he's handsome and potentially easygoing. At this point, a commotion breaks out at the other end of the platform, and 5 guards, referred to as M-Corp security guards, chase a man, demanding he turn on something called his Ferrotech. The man tries to refuse, but is unable, and hence start the whispers on the platform. He must be a neg. Maggie notices Quentin's curiosity in this situation and his disgust, another very obvious tell that he is not in fact a terrible person, as insanely rich as we've been told he is. The guards hook a device onto the band of the man they're chasing. Let's just imagine, for the sake of the story, that these bands, M-bands, are basically Apple Watches or Fitbits. Shervington probably based them on Fitbits based on the time of the story, and that's what I've always imagined them as. Anyway, these guards are clearly going to arrest this man for being a quote neg, and the man knows it. He's shaking, freaking out, and there's this line, quote, he begged them to let him go, crying out in broken sobs for a chance to make right whatever it was that he'd done, or was going to do, wrong. Keep that in mind for later. No one on the platform helps the man, and the guards clearly don't care. As the train approaches, Quentin moves towards the guards and man, and Maggie has a brief second to wonder whether he might intervene on the man's behalf before the man breaks free and runs in front of the train. Wondrous opening chapter, right? We're then presented with this, presumably a pamphlet released 9 years ago, called the Individual Identification Act, which declares that the government has mandated compulsory microchips for each person, which will be used for identification, GPS, and medicine. All temporary and permanent residents of the US need to be fitted with a current M-Corp microchip or face legal punishment. Ah, the dystopian life. Alright, back in the modern day, Maggie is in an underground parking garage, or car park for Australians. No wonder I had no clue this was written by an Australian. There's this paragraph which I find interesting. Quote, I glanced down at my sleek M-band, missing the days when a simple wristwatch sat in its place, when life wasn't dictated by whatever data it spewed out. But those days are gone. It had only taken 9 years for the world to change completely and forever. You'd have thought that we were better than that. You'd have thought we'd fight harder and stronger. And yeah, this is very... Well, it's telling me exactly what's going on, but it also has a genuine message that we need to fight against potentially harmful changes in our society, and critiques how little people do indeed fight and how much they just accept things. Considering the current state of the US, I found this very poignant and relevant, and a depressing prediction from a book that was written 2 years before a certain dude whose name starts with a T even became part of the Australian and global consciousness. And, you know, since the point of a dystopian novel is to comment on something about the world, and a lot of them miss that in the place of romance, I thought this was a pleasant surprise, that the book had more to say than I actually thought it did. Now, I'll get into what the book has to say later in more depth, but for now, basically, it's about how technology shouldn't dictate our every moment and every movement, and how we should fight for what we believe in and keep our morals and values. This section of the book also makes it obvious that the main thing people want out of these M-bands is their ability to tell you your compatibility with someone. Duh, guys, this isn't just a dystopian, it's a YA dystopian romance. At this point, Maggie also tells us that there's a movement called Preference Evolution, or Pre-Evo, which are against the M-bands, but she won't work with them because she doesn't believe that being a team player will get her anywhere. She also sees a sign saying rehabilitation leads to reintegration, with a picture of a rehabilitation farm for negs. Of course, Maggie knows that these are propaganda and the conditions the negs live in aren't actually that nice. Hey, does this sound familiar? Maggie phones a dude called Gus, who Maggie staunchly declares is not her friend, and who we later find out she has been blackmailing for a decent period of time to do her tech bidding. This is the start of the Maggie is a bad person train arc fact of life. She says she's given everything, she won't be a team player, and that there will be no warm fuzzies with Gus in this segment, so we know basically she's a badass Ice Queen YA protagonist. At this point, we also find out that Maggie's family are mega poor, and her mum works long shifts at the hospital to pay off debts they should never have had, having already had to leave their hometown and change their surnames to escape the gossip. Of what? Tune in later. And apparently the government is introducing a poverty tax? which definitely sounds like something the current American government would do. A man enters the garage from the office above and gets into his car, pulling out a second M-band, which gives Maggie a chance to snap some photos of him for potential blackmail evidence, and to tell us that it's illegal to own more than one M-band, but that people like this man often have a black market one for things like going to clubs and cheating on their wives. During this section, we also find out that Maggie likes control and power, and since her dad used to tell her that information is power, well, we've already seen her collect information. Now, I won't read it all out loud, one, in fear of copyright strikes, and two, because then this video would be way too long. But this is the start of the banter between Maggie and Gus that continues for the rest of the duology. And say what you want about how it's actually written, but I think it's fun, and it makes both of them, and especially Gus, more likable. It's also engaging in my opinion. For example, let me read you this segment. There was music and the distinct sound of chatter in the background. "Where are you?" I asked, suddenly suspicious. "Drinking my way into oblivion. I'm hoping that when I get there, you aren't. You'd better not be drunk," I warned. "You know, Maggie, there are places for people like you. They bring you food and little round pills, and you get to lie in bed all day and talk about your feelings. I think you'd like it." It's not the best example, but, I had fun. So, Gus is a brilliant hacker and has disabled the cameras in the car park so Maggie can enter one of the lifts unseen. She opens the hatch on the roof and finds a door that has been disguised, blending into the wall between two levels. Opening the door with a hacked access card, Maggie enters a series of transit tunnels and pulls out her tranquilizer gun, somewhat fondly referred to as the trank gun throughout the duology. How cool of her. Apparently, car parks are the way to get into the transit tunnels for some reason or another, and these tunnels connect various hubs of up to 1,000 people with a main hub in Mount Weather. These hubs were initially designed to keep the population safe in case of an apocalypse, but now are being used to hold negs. Transit pods or autonomous bubble-shaped vehicles run through the transit tunnels, so of course, in true Dauntless fashion, Maggie needs to run and jump onto them. And since they only have a very small handle, goodness knows why they have a handle to begin with, it's hard to get on and off of them, and you're likely to get hurt. When she jumps off the pod, Maggie twists her ankle and gets gravel up her butt. Brilliant. As someone who has been thrown off a horse and had gravel embedded in my butt, I can vouch for Maggie that this isn't a very nice experience. Each of the neg hubs are huge bowl-shaped spaces underground, with many buildings in the middle and truck access, and they're full of guards and neg prisoners. Maggie has to abseil down to the roof of one of these buildings to gain entry, at which point she hides in a junction. While waiting for a prisoner to arrive, Maggie explains the concept of negs to us. They're people who have a chemical imbalance and are unable to rate positively with others, relationship-wise, that is. Any random person on the street will rate negatively with at least a few people. It's part of life that we don't get along with everyone. But negs rate negatively with everyone, all the time, without fail. Now, here's where it gets nasty. When this was discovered, it was found out that many negs were already in prisons for violent crimes, and many who were outside of prisons started to show a tendency towards crime, so negs were branded as a pollution to society. Negative ratings with others was shown to lead to violent outcomes, so negs were branded as irredeemable, and the government allowed M-Corp to take over with their M-chips and M-bans, and to take away and, quote, rehabilitate, read, lock up in concentration camps, negs. At this point, we find out that Maggie's father was a neg who was taken away, thus giving us context for her unusual behaviour, her motivation to be down here in the neg hubs, and for her family's situation. When her father was discovered as a neg, not only did they lose a member of their family, but they also had to flee the disdain of others for even being associated with a neg, and they had to settle all of their father's debts while losing his income. Lovely. You can see why Maggie has a vendetta against this society, especially since, this technology only becoming common 9 years ago, she's had a chance to grow up without it. Anyway, waiting in a tunnel, a prisoner runs into Maggie and quickly realizes that Maggie is illegally in the tunnels. Maggie bribes him with information about the outside world in exchange for him telling her whether he's seen her father in the hub. He hasn't seen her father. At this point, we find out two things. First, that Maggie probably correctly feels that no matter how good of a person someone was when they entered the hubs, being down here would turn anyone evil, hence a self-fulfilling prophecy of negs becoming the trash that society thinks they are. Second, we find out that Maggie wishes she could break people out of these prisons, but feels that they'd slow her down and would likely get both of them killed. This is a point which, 1, is used to explain why she hasn't been breaking people out, duh, and also 2, becomes a point of character motivation, maybe, for Maggie, as she gets to hate herself out of this. For instance, we have this section which illustrates just my point. Quote, "I look at his chest, avoiding his eyes, and winced. I hated it when they told me their names. It made the nightmares so much worse." This neg, Ben, refuses to let her leave without him, so Maggie knocks him out and skedaddles, going back home, while Gus, via phone, correctly tells her she'll get caught one day. See, Gus has common sense. At this point, Maggie wants to expand her search into new areas, but Gus's contact has probably been killed, so he needs to find a new one. This prompts Maggie to realise that her best plan is probably the plan, which will be enacted far faster than the several months it would take Gus to find a new contact. Gus thinks she's insane, being the voice of reason yet again. I do want to point this out before we get there though. Maggie says, quote, "The person staring back at me was a stranger, someone who'd taken the girl I was 2 years ago and stripped her down only to rebuild a different person. Now I was strong, I was capable and smart. They were the good qualities, but I was also calculated, manipulative and selfish. Thankfully, we get to skip the stuff about her plain body and face and messy brown hair, although earlier in the book she did make a comment about pulling her ponytail tight and about how she hates how the gravel has ruined yet another pair of jeans." Why is she running around in jeans when she has to do borderline acrobatics? Because she's a YA main character, of course. Now, one thing I do appreciate about this book, which I'll explain later, is that Maggie is a terrible person. I wouldn't necessarily say she's a brilliantly written 3D, morally dubious character, but she is an interesting YA protagonist, because many YA protagonists are terrible people, but they rarely acknowledge it, and the plot rarely treats them that way. And while I wouldn't necessarily say that the plot treats Maggie like a terrible person, at least not in this book, she is a terrible person, and it's brought to attention quite often. Sure, this does let her mope and wallow in self-pity a lot, which comes off as somewhat Mary Sue-ish, but overall she's a terrible person, and as bad as she feels about it, she knows that she's a terrible person, which is a nice point of uniqueness about this book. Mind you, she's a far more terrible person than even she mentions, and you'll see exactly how terrible she is as we continue. Anyway, Maggie has a dream about how she and her dad used to go to this diner, where they see a waitress who always rates poorly with people who the customers don't like, and her dad mourns the presence of the M-bands, which result in no one actually having genuine connections anymore. In the morning, Maggie explains to us that in order to enact her plan of hooking Quentin, the youngest of the 3 sons of the Mercer Corp, who basically run the world at this point, she had to get into the same prestigious school as him, which involved tons of study, saving up, and buying cheat sheets to get a scholarship and maintain appropriate grades, a point she contrasts with Quentin, who she reckons probably got in automatically, and who she reckons gets sent the same cheat sheets as his brothers, but can't even be bothered to read them properly since he gets lower grades than his brothers did. At school, Maggie plants herself at the front steps and Quentin shows up. This is where we get yet another hint of him being potentially different. He gets dropped off at the corner, not at the front door like other students, which Maggie reckons is him trying and failing to fit in. This also gives us a great chance for a more in-depth description of him. In true YA fashion, he's confident, at ease, a bit wayward with an untucked shirt and one shoelace of his glossy shoes undone. He's apparently a, quote, walking contradiction. He's handsome and has a scar on the edge of his hairline which would totally make him look prettier if he covered it, but he keeps it out anyway. This is apparently the one thing that Maggie likes about him. Maggie stands in his way, which greatly confuses Quentin, who almost walks into her, expecting her to get out of the way, and then literally says, "I have a girlfriend," to her, which both Maggie and I thought was hilarious. He comes close to using the "do you know who I am" line as Maggie continues to stand in his way, but eventually goes back down the stairs and up the other side. And yeah, I thought this scene was hilarious. It's so small, but it really shows the dynamic the two main characters have, at least at the start, and I feel like it sets up a nice tension between them. Oh, Maggie's also been blackmailing the librarian to give her cheat sheets. Blackmail really is a favourite tactic of hers. But this one is kind of crazy. She says that she threatened to kill Miss Cooper's dog to make her agree to the deal. Like, dude, imagine if our YA protagonist had literally killed a dog. Thankfully, Shervington is happy with her protagonist blackmailing, gaslighting, and manipulating people, and also with her leaving negs in concentration camps and beating people up, but she draws the line at killing puppies. That's probably a good thing because we all know that you could be a serial murderer, but as soon as you kill a dog, you deserve to go to the darkest pit of hell. So, it turns out that when you turn 18, the government mandates that you change your M-band, bringing in a new one which has the pheromone reading data, aka allows you to match with anyone else who has the program turned on within a 2-meter radius. These ratings range from -1s to incompatible to friendships, lust matches, and romantic relationships, all the way up to, well, this is a YA, guys, the 100% true match, of course. I'll give you one guess as to what's going to happen. Well, your guess was probably right, but also probably wrong. You'll see. Anyway, it's voluntary to keep the tech off, but you do need to register 4 ratings a month to help detect negs. And if you register 4 or more negative ratings in a month, you'll be flagged as a potential neg. This is important to know, guys. Maggie, Quentin, Quentin's girlfriend Ivy, and 2 other students have turned 18 recently, and are due to have their bands changed today. For reasons of keeping the numbers below 4, Maggie drugs one of these random boys, so he has to go home. Also, everyone has been betting that Quentin and Ivy will have a 70+% match, so Maggie plans to make lots of money by literally disrupting that. Also, Gus is running the M-band changes, since he works for M-Corp. Gus brings everyone in one at a time, starting with Maggie. Now, sorry for all the tech stuff, but I really need to explain the details of this. Each person is supposed to take an inhaler which is supposed to clear the gland between your mouth and nose, which releases the pheromone signals. And then your old band is discarded and the new one is connected to your chip, before all of the new 18-year-olds match with each other to check the tech. These ratings are recorded for government reasons, presumably, and everyone goes on their merry way staring at numbers all day to sort out their relationships. Maggie being first gives her the chance to dump the contents of Quentin's inhaler in a flower pot and to replace them with the contents of a vial she brought with her, making Gus even more nervous than he already was. The vial is a remnant of her father, vaguely. Gus completes the process with Maggie in time for Quentin to enter, at which point this hilariously odd moment occurs. Quote, Quentin's M-chip linking correctly with his new M-band that was resting by Gus's computer. Out of nowhere, my band flashed and released a 3-beep blast. Startled, I looked down at the screen. The air left my lungs in a rush and another series of beeps sounded. Heart rate, blood pressure, I was going off like a freaking fire alarm. A small moment that becomes much bigger later on, so keep this in mind. Anyway, obviously both Gus and Quentin think this is weird, but Maggie brushes it off as being nervous. But Gus won't stop staring at her until she gives him a pointed glare. Once everyone is gathered and linked up to their M-bands, Gus instructs them to activate the tech, and the evil plan begins. Let me tell you. Quote, within a matter of seconds, his M-band registered 1, then 2, then 3 people in his immediate proximity, and the colour drained from his face and his shoulders rolled forwards. I'll explain for the sake of saving time, although obviously the book draws this out. The chemicals Maggie gave Quentin are called a disruption, roll credits, that basically make him negatively rate with every single person for a small period of time. Hence, he's just rated negatively with Ivy, Maggie, and the random boy called Nathan. Had the 5th kid been there, or should Quentin register another negative rating, he would be flagged as a neg. He is a neg as far as he knows. And this is where the horrors of this book begin. So let me take you through the rating summary because the book does. Quentin rated negatively with both Ivy and Nathan, obviously. Ivy and Nathan rated highly, which he's happy about and she's disgusted about. Maggie and Nathan rated incompatible but not negative. Ivy and Maggie had a 45% rating, which is a strong friendship rating. This surprises Maggie because she doesn't like Ivy, who so far has been portrayed as a pretty airhead, big boobs and obsessed with Quentin's looks and money, and who has also flirted with Gus. This starts an unfortunate trend in these books, Maggie not being a girl's girl and in fact, sometimes literally, not like other girls. But I'll talk more about that later. Basically, Ivy and Maggie are supposedly destined to be friends, and having already had 2 negative ratings, Quentin is in dangerous territory. So when Gus asks for his rating with Maggie, Maggie lies and tells Gus 82%. Quentin catches onto her plan and backs this up, and thus the students go their separate ways, with Maggie now rich from betting against the Quentin-Ivy pairing. Speaking of, they awkwardly break up on the spot. Afterwards, Quentin thanks Maggie for helping him, to which Shervington delivers this wonderful paragraph. Quote, "I feigned a sigh. 'Look, you're a neg,' I said, ignoring the way he flinched at the word. 'The second you turn on your ferrotech again, you'll tip over the 3 limit and there's nothing you can do about it. Your flag will activate and then, you know the drill. You've got until the end of the month to register another rating. My advice, don't turn it back on until you figure out what you're going to do.' And thus starts some of the most terrible gaslighting and emotional manipulation I've seen out of a book, let alone a main character. Maggie's plan is to say all of this horrible stuff to Quentin and then to feign apathy, but he knows that since she helped him, she does care and does have a sense of justice. So while she gets to walk off, leaving him with the bomb that she has no doubt his family will lock him away regardless of the fact that he's family, Quentin is left behind in his depression and with his identity completely shattered. Maggie even repeatedly tells him that if he's so high and mighty, he should just turn his tech on right now to have something to chat with his family about that night. Like, this is insane. And so is this line. Quote, "But then as I stalked down the hall, I cringed, because if it hadn't been for me, Quentin Mercer would not have rated negative at all." Absolute fire, Shervington. And what a poor kid Quentin is. I mean, I have always felt sorry for him, but when I was 11, I didn't have the same education and life experience as I do now, and I couldn't appreciate, for lack of a better word, the insanely massive psychological impacts Maggie's manipulation would have on him in a real-life situation. And yeah, the book explores some of these impacts, but not all of them, and certainly not to the extent that I think they should have been explored. Anyway, after school, Maggie goes to work. She works in the same M-Band store as Gus, and when she gets there, Gus teases her about how dreamy Quentin is, and about those 3 beeps her band let off, to which Maggie comments to herself that Gus still has faith in the system after everything they've done. After work, Maggie goes to a gym where she meets up with another underrated character, Master Ra, a martial arts master who runs the gym, gave Maggie information about the tunnels, and taught her Muay Thai. She also participates in show fights for him, which earns both of them money. He tells her about a guy who's been coming in, who Master Ra wants her to talk to. A pre-Evo guy, aka Preference Evolution. Master Ra wants her to join pre-Evo for her own safety, but of course, Maggie refuses. At home, Maggie runs into her mum making dinner, giving her a chance to give more context about how their family was ruined after her dad was taken, and for her to ask about her elder brother Sam, who works at a nightclub, and who is apparently off with some girl. The descriptions of Maggie's mum make it obvious that she is a beautiful woman who a hard life has made gaunt and emotionally fragile. She's doing her best for her 2 children and only wants the best for them, but is obviously struggling, and we see throughout the story that she's worried about how much Maggie is overworking herself. The next day at school, Maggie runs into Quentin. Everyone in the school has heard about their supposed high rating and now assumes they'll go out, 82% being well into the long-term relationship category. Quentin quietly brings up something Maggie mentioned previously, the possibility that she'd be able to help him, and she checks he hasn't turned on his tech since, and tells him that she needs to make sure he won't betray her to his family, to which he obviously points out that, as a neg, he isn't in a position to bargain with her his saviour, is he? They agree to meet up at lunchtime, which lets us establish that Maggie is a big fan of hot dogs and other junk food. Quentin asks why she would even help him, to which she tells him an incredibly vague version of the story about her father suddenly becoming a neg. Quentin expresses how, as society tells them, he, as a neg, must be a bad person, who is supposed to be a hazard and dangerous, and who has the potential to become a terrible person, no matter how good he currently thinks he is. This has clearly massively destroyed his self-esteem and made him question his entire life. Maggie feigns apathy throughout all of this, although she does feel guilty. Nonetheless, she tells him that if he gets her into one of the M-Corp labs, she can get a chemical that can create a temporary disruption which will help him rate positively for a few hours at a time. This would allow him to reach the 4 per month quota, or to display himself as a Mercer bachelor at parties without being in danger of being flagged. Throughout this conversation, Maggie repeatedly reminds him of the danger he's currently in. He needs to record at least one more rating by the end of the month, and she's the only one who could possibly help him. Reading this conversation and others throughout the book is disturbing, because as an adult I can see all of the times that Quentin's on the verge of just walking away, and Maggie draws him back in with more gaslighting and manipulation, and through telling him about how the science says he's a terrible person, but she's willing to help him anyway, since I guess she's a righteous angel? Also, she wants to find her father, which is the motivation she gives him for wanting to get into the labs, so she can find him. Quentin literally comes so close to the point in this conversation, commenting that it's convenient that he's now in her debt, considering she needs to go to the same place. But somehow Maggie manages to wave this off, and I guess Quentin just accepts her answer for some reason. At work, Maggie gets a chance to degrade more women. Her co-worker Stella, who is a wacko caricature of a shallow lady, has just had a boob job and brings Maggie out the back and forces this freshly 18-year-old high schooler to fondle her new boobs to feel how good they are, and then tells her to try it since Maggie's chest is, in her own words, uninspiring. Although Maggie expresses concern for Stella, Stella is painted as shallow, lacking social skills, and obsessed with her looks, which isn't a good look for this book. We've had 3 relevant female side characters so far: Maggie's mum, who is emotionally fragile and unable to take proper care of herself or her kids, Ivy, who is a shallow and flirtatious possible money digger, and Stella, who is obsessed with her looks and makes Maggie fondle her. Lovely. Anyway, that night, Gus and Maggie go to meet his new contact, a man called Travis. How did he get a new contact so quickly? No clue. This meeting happens to be at the bar Maggie's brother Sam works at, and Sam, of course, finds her, underage in America, drinking. He reluctantly lets her stay with a water shot instead after she spins a story about meeting a guy there, at which point, guess who shows up? Yep, Quentin, who's at the bar with his brother and who is apparently a, quote, visual feast, and also borderline drunk and not super happy about being stuck with Maggie. Quentin getting in her way makes Maggie late to seeing Gus get dragged out the back and beat up by his new contact, which gives Maggie a chance to show off her fighting skills by beating the contact up and, notably, kneeing him in the balls. This new contact, Travis, hands over the information and everyone complains about the danger Quentin being around has put them in. Speaking of, Quentin runs into Gus and Maggie outside, revealing that he was, in fact, not drunk, and pretending for his brother, and also he is suspicious of Maggie. But also, in the act of taunting him about his neg status, Maggie lets slip that he's supposedly gorgeous, which brings us the knowledge that Quentin also likes teasing, and all of the teenage girls swooned. At school, people have suddenly started paying attention to Maggie, including a guy called Ryan, who, through implications, asks her if she wants to go out, before getting death-glared by Quentin, who has clearly decided that the way to go is method acting as Maggie's protective rich boyfriend. He also tells her off for supposedly flirting with every guy in the school, and describes the two of them as a thing, something Maggie did not expect him to say, but she's unable to deny Quentin's amazing logic that it makes the most sense for them to pretend to be in a relationship. Trope City. And now for the real test. Maggie tells Quentin to meet her after work and introduces him more formally to Gus. The two basically imply that Gus had noticed that Quentin was a neg and had also worked with Maggie to defend him and hide this fact, which leads to this wonderful paragraph from Maggie about Quentin. Quote, "Damn it, I actually felt sorry for the guy. You could tell the pheromone rating had really screwed with him. For a guy always used to being in charge and getting what he wanted, he was now so uncertain. And while I felt low about it, there was another side of me, the one driving my actions, that found myself feeling satisfied that this uncertainty was making him play right into my hands." Dang, Maggie! Quentin assures Gus and Maggie that he won't do anything to trouble them, since, well, they helped him and he kind of needs their help. And the two break the news to him that they want to get into one of his family's labs tonight. At which point they find out that Quentin has literally no clue about the underground labs and hubs. So Maggie tells him to get into some more appropriate clothes and they meet up. Quentin apparently looking very good in faded jeans and a long sleeve shirt, which shows off how he apparently clearly works out. Oh dear. Quentin and Maggie have a lot of at least somewhat interesting conversations throughout this book, such as this one where they talk about how Quentin likes being able to be more himself when he isn't as recognizable and put together as he has to be as a Mercer heir. These conversations are the kinds that flesh out the two characters, and of course they are meant to make both the reader and Maggie feel more fondly towards Quentin, who really is the embodiment of the trope of a rich boy with a secret heart of gold, who just wants to be able to be himself, not the statuesque figure he's supposed to be at family functions. Anyway, Maggie and Quentin make their way into the underground tunnels, and him demonstrating his physical prowess and ability to keep up with her is another thing that makes Maggie more appreciative of Quentin. They make their way to the lab in Junction 17, and Maggie plugs a USB into a computer for Gus to download things, while Quentin gets to have a horrific time looking at the documents around the room. But of course, not everything can go right, because Gus interrupts them, telling them that it's cleaning day at Junction 18, too close to their current location. This gives Maggie an idea to take Quentin there, especially since she finds out that he's actually naive enough to think that all of the propaganda about rehabilitation farms is real. Maggie takes Quentin to Junction 18, where she's able to show him what a cleaning day actually is. All of the items the Negs have with them are dumped in a pile, and the Negs are loaded into trucks, taken off to presumably be exterminated. This is, of course, an important step in his education that actually his father's business empire isn't as brilliant as he initially thought it was. Quentin and Maggie need to get out of the tunnels, so Maggie calls a transit pod, knocks out a guard inside, and they hitch a ride on it back to the entrance. At this point, Maggie notes that Quentin's eyes show how much his worldview has been changed, and how the new reality he's living in is unfamiliar and unkind. They head to Maggie's place to clean up, which is probably an example of the story being plot-driven, not character-driven, because I don't think there's a single reason Maggie, considering her very controlled and secretive character, would bring Quentin back to her home, which is private and also shows just how much her family is struggling. Mind you, this section does fulfill its purpose of allowing the characters to bond, as Quentin gets to have a borderline breakdown about the fact that all of the Negs have died, while Maggie gets to have a borderline breakdown about how good his bare back looks when he needs to take off his shirt for her to disinfect his wounds. The two have a very awkward half conversation where Quentin asks if his father is a murderer, and after a failed diversion, Maggie says, quote, "I don't think he pulls the trigger if that's what you meant," which of course is not what he meant, and he leaves quietly. Quentin then insists that they visit one of the actual rehabilitation farms as advertised on billboards, not as part of the media tours he's done, but when no one is expecting him. On the train, they have a conversation about whether Maggie is scared of Negs, and she points out how having their freedom taken away and being stuck underground would make many of them turn bad. She acknowledges that many of them are terrible people, but that she doesn't necessarily believe what society says, that they're destined to do terrible things. She also mentions that she thinks that they should only be detained after they've actually done bad things, not preemptively, which Quentin, to her surprise, agrees with. Once they arrive at the farm, they sneak around the back and climb over a barbed wire fence, and Quentin realizes that the farm is very different from the last time he was there. There used to be animals, tables and chairs, a meditation center, and so on, but now there's smoke. Smoke coming from a series of negs who are being branded on their hips before being taken underground. The farms are where the negs are processed. Their information is stored, they and their families are interviewed, they're branded, and so on. This gives Quentin and Maggie a chance to have an argument. He's noticed how much she's been documenting and believes that the information she has will be able to make a difference, but she says she's only trying to find her dad, not change the world, and thus he says he doesn't believe her. Just before they leave, they see that one of the negs has been shot and killed, which obviously has a big emotional effect on Quentin. Later, Gus finds out that Maggie's father was flagged a while ago in relation to a Cord Junction, a place rumoured to have brainwashing, torture and execution chambers, and a place swarming with guards and activities that even Gus can't get her in and out alive. They need tons of information and also DNA clearance, the kinds of things they can only get from Quentin. And the question is, will Quentin be willing to get them that information? On Saturday, so I guess this book's been going for about a week, Maggie is training in her garage when Quentin walks in and challenges her to a fight, which he pretty instantly loses despite his epic muscles and black belt in karate. The book gives 2 reasons for this. 1, that men may be stronger, but women, or as Shervington says, girls, are faster. And 2, because Muay Thai allows attacks with the elbows and knees, which apparently isn't allowed in karate and which catches Quentin off guard. Wow, so we can add flirty fight scenes to the list of tropes in this book, I guess. Back in Maggie's room, Quentin mentions a party he has to go to that night, since his family are getting suspicious of him, and he needs a dose of the disruption. Maggie pulls out a vial she's made, which of course is just a placebo, and gives it to him, telling him it will work for a few hours. This also leads to a hilarious, for those of you who know the end of the book, moment where Quentin asks to test it with her and she refuses, giving the excuse that the system isn't real anyway. So Quentin makes her come with him, suspicious she's setting him up. This party scene allows us to get tons of not like the other girls from Maggie. The scene starts with her having no idea about current fashion trends and mentioning that she prefers magazines about tasers and defensive tools compared to fashion, and that she doesn't have any good options anyway, eventually going for some mascara and eyeshadow. She also makes a comment about how colours are currently in, but, quote, "Pink and I just don't mesh." Lovely, Maggie. She also wishes for her sweatpants and t-shirt on the way out. But in another cliche, of course, Quentin is very appreciative of her outfit, and that's all that matters, I guess. This is also where we get more Quentin depression/torture porn, as he implies that she's very attractive, something Maggie doesn't seem to get. At which point, he delivers this banger. Quote, "I'm a neg, Maggie. What I think doesn't matter." Oh, I feel so sorry for this guy. Maggie has literally manipulated him into thinking he's less than worthless. Insane. The party is held at the house of one Morris Delaware, who is apparently one of the nicer rich kids at school. He's a classic athletic star and is the son of a senator. When Maggie and Quentin arrive at the party, Quentin takes the fake disruption, and Morris greets Quentin. It turns out the 2 of them have a really good friendship rating. Morris also greets Maggie nicely and compliments her looks, which, combined with Maggie's internal dialogue pointing out that he's got kind eyes and a nice laugh, tells us that he's rich, sure, but he's also a good person. Maggie, feeling awkward about her interactions with Morris and Quentin, and with the fact that she is, for the first time, at a party with people who actually know who she is, retreats to a veranda to read magazines, but not before she gives us some extra context about teenage life with Ferritech. For instance, lower rates of teen sex and STDs, and she tells us how Morris has created a casino in his house. Quentin also makes a point of making her look around the room, at which point she does indeed see that all of the boys think she's hot, and all of the girls are jealous of her being with Quentin. On the veranda, she details an article about a 43-year-old man who was so obsessed with his true match that he started travelling the world to find her. Something Maggie finds ridiculous, especially since he would have turned down many legitimate relationships in hopes of even the tiniest chance of finding his true match.
spurred on by the technology. This also lets her tell us that true matches are celebrities, and often have power, fame, and money with that status, presumably because they're so rare. A dude comes out of the party and starts harassing her about how Quentin is currently surrounded by girls, only to be shooed off by Morris, which gives Maggie the chance to find out that Quentin told him to keep other guys away from her, which leads to a hilarious moment where Maggie glances back inside at Quentin, only to make eye contact with him as he jealously glares back at her. Brilliant. Both are fuming on the way home, and Maggie gives Quentin a stern talking to. He apologizes, and they're pretty much all good again. Then he brings it up. The ball happening at his family's estate in a week. He needs a date, and although Maggie suggests one of the girls he rated well with that evening, he wants her to come, because he doesn't need to lie to her about their relationship. This gives Maggie a great chance to consider the psychological damage she's done to him. Every rating he had that night was real, but he believes they're all false. Thus, he's unlikely to ever feel close to someone again. Even after she gives him what she'll tell him is a permanent disruption and he gets in a long-term relationship, he'll never let himself get close to someone, thinking they're in a fake relationship. Poor guy. Anyway, the thing that makes Maggie agree to go is the knowledge that there's a mainframe computer at Quentin's house, which they could hack to get tons of junction codes. Thus, she needs to go dress shopping, something she has, of course, not being like other girls, not done before. Maggie suffers through a few colourful dresses before asking the shop assistant for anything that doesn't have a skirt, quote, as large as a small house. The attendant anxiously asks if she's brave and if she likes black, and when Maggie says she does, she's given the perfect dress. Walking through the shops, Maggie finds Quentin with some of his friends and starts to feel like a faker, and also starts to feel guilt. Now that she's seeing what a decent person Quentin is, and she can see how happy and casual he is with his friends, well, what has she done to him? Good question, you terrible person. She has an awkward conversation with the girls in the group, in which the girls are painted as obsessed with Quentin and with romance, and being shallow airheads who blindly follow the tech. This is so annoying that Maggie just leaves, and Quentin follows her, to her surprise but also guilt, knowing he wouldn't follow her if he knew the truth. The next day, Maggie is back in the tunnels, checking if her dad is in a community about to be cleaned out. He's not. Returning home, she has an awkward conversation with her mum, in which her mum begs her to not overwork herself, and in which Maggie is forced to reveal that she's going to the Mercer Ball and is, in fact, borderline dating Quentin Mercer of all people. Maggie's mum is horrified that Quentin Mercer has been in her house, and is banking on the fake 82% rating between them to keep the relationship going, since people like Quentin just don't care about the poor plebs like them. Anyway, Maggie has another dream about her father. Remember that diner and the waitress who never rated well? Well, Maggie's dad puts something in the waitress's drink, although it doesn't seem to have any effect. Maggie takes Gus's car to go back to the tunnels, where she quickly runs into a girl who figures out that she broke in and wants to use this to her advantage. She cryptically tells Maggie that she's seen her father but won't give any further details unless Maggie gets her out of the tunnels. Honestly, I'm really shocked that no one tried this previously with Maggie. Anyway, Maggie reluctantly agrees, telling the girl Sarah that if she falls behind, she's being left behind. Sarah manages to keep up with her surprisingly well, but they get caught by guards, who shoot Sarah dead and hit Maggie in the flank. Maggie barely manages to escape and drives back to Gus's place, where he urges her to go to a hospital, and of course, she refuses. I mean, I'd refuse too with American healthcare. Anyway, Maggie is bleeding out, and Gus has to do his best to patch it up with what little he has, aka vodka. She passes out and wakes up back on her bed at home, with Gus looking a bit guilty, having, you guessed it, called Quentin to keep an eye on her while he goes out and gets supplies. This is a scene for the Wump lovers for real. So of course Maggie's pissed about this, and Quentin is also pretty pissed that she managed to get herself hurt so badly, and literally does the whole, "Who did this to you?" thing. He of course refuses to go. Maggie, presumably losing her mind because of the blood loss, almost confesses her crimes to him, but doesn't, because she's a terrible person. Quentin helps Maggie get changed, which is a great chance for 1. Tension, and 2.
to show what a green flag Quentin is, as he is very respectful, giving her warning of what he's going to do, being gentle, and making sure at all stages of the process she's covered modestly with a blanket. Oh, I didn't mention it earlier, but apart from the fact that he's just generally the most interesting character in the duology, one of the reasons I like Quentin so much and feel so bad for him is that he is the biggest walking green flag you'll probably find in 2010's YA literature. He has his moments, for instance being jealous and possessive and not respecting Maggie's wishes about those things, but on the whole he's kind, considerate, selfless and respectful. It's clear based on later parts of the series that he was written to be a complete foil to Maggie, and it works really well. It also makes the evils she commits against him so much worse because he's such a good person and she borderline psychologically tortures him with, initially at least, no concern for his safety and well-being. Ugh, Quentin deserved better. Like Ivy. Ivy's a girl boss babe, as we'll see later. Anyway, this scene is mega wump, and I guess Maggie also finds respect hot because this is the first time she thinks about kissing Quentin. Maggie dreams about the diner again. Now they come here every single Thursday night, and every Thursday night her father slips something into the waitress's drink with no effect. But this night it does work, and Beth starts rating higher than she usually does. She's far happier and interacts better with the customers, which makes Maggie and her father ecstatic. When Maggie wakes up, she sees Quentin and Gus talking. They check her bandage, which she has bled through, and Gus brings out some expensive high-grade disinfectant and a staple gun, and staples her up. Maggie finds it important to mention that Gus staples her 3 times on the front and 4 at the back. After this, Gus leaves quickly and quietly, something Maggie explains as he's apparently just spent all of their combined money and a bunch of his own money to buy these supplies, leaving them in a bad position. The next morning, Quentin is still sticking around and only just gets Maggie awake and hides before her mum comes in, which leads to an awkward conversation where her mum asks about the ball and tells her about how dreamy Quentin is, while Maggie is hyper aware of Quentin in the bathroom. When her mum leaves and Quentin emerges, Maggie asks him if he wants to gloat, and he just leaves, saying, quote, "People see an ideal, it's nothing to gloat about." The week passes with Maggie not going to school, but she's quickly up and about, working on her strength and constantly remembering Sarah, who could have had the information she needed to find her father, but who she let die. She attempts to go for a walk around the block and Quentin finds her, where they have an argument about her being up and about before she joins him in the car and they go back to her place. At Maggie's place, she first notices how amazing and haggard Quentin looks, having not shaved for a few days, and then the two consider the cleaning days. It just doesn't make sense for M Corp to keep so many negs alive for so long and spend so much time feeding and housing them to then kill them all, so something else must be happening. While they consider this, Maggie notices a bag Quentin brought, which has a hot dog, her favourite food. She offers him a bite and after hesitating he takes one, which apparently makes his face light up and he takes another bite. I wouldn't discuss this at all, but it's an important moment in the story to highlight Quentin becoming less uptight. Maggie tells him that she reckons some negs are relocated to research facilities, and some are given to the military, explaining why America's military no longer needs to recruit but is stronger than ever. The negs have no reason to disagree to this because, well, they're negs and they have nothing better waiting for them. I guess at least the army is, supposedly kind of respectable? This causes Quentin to hope that there's hope for the negs. They're fighting for a cause, to which the two argue about whether or not lives should be dictated by a number. Quentin is convinced he's now worthless, since, well, his whole life he's been told that the numbers are everything. Let me give you a wonderful example of his logic. Quote, his sad eyes met mine. I'm a neg, Maggie. There is something in me that makes me this way. On some level, I'm wrong. Maybe I should just accept that. Come clean. Oh, this poor kid. So this prompts Maggie to feel guilty about the emotional manipulation she's currently in the process of, but she decides not to confess, and instead tells him the story about her father creating the pheromone booster at the diner, and how excited she was that it could help people. He then came home one day having started to rate negatively with everyone, even her mother, who he had initially had a very good long-term relationship rating with, which caused her mum to think he'd done something unforgivable, and thus he was taken away. She then delivers this banger of a line, quote, "The system is flawed. My father was no more a neg than you are." Which on one hand is good because it really emphasises Maggie's belief that the system is bad and thus highlights a major theme in the story, but it's also good because it's her kind of admitting to Quentin that he's not a neg. Neither he nor her father are real negs, but of course to him it just comes across as her distrust of the system. Before he leaves, Quentin clarifies with her whether she's sure that she wants to come to the ball and try and hack the family computer in her current state, and Maggie says she's certain, and that she'll find him a permanent disruption before they run out of the temporary one. The next day, Maggie gets to be even more not like other girls. She's never gone to a ball or a high school dance before, and feels stupid getting dressed up. She struggles with her hair before deciding to leave it out, making a comment that the only uses she knows for bobby pins are breaking and entering. Lovely. It turns out that the bottom of the dress is see-through, a fact that Maggie awkwardly finds out when she asks herself if it is, and Quentin, having let himself in, answers in the affirmative. He helps her find a clip of fabric that apparently covers the quote important parts, which makes her even more embarrassed, and they leave. At this point, she tells him not to give her any compliments, and he replies that it wouldn't matter anyway, since his opinions don't matter, him being a neg. This depressing line leads to a hilarious conversation where Maggie insists that she doesn't believe a system that listens to glands, not brains, to which Quentin asks about hearts, which she says are overrated. Very not like other girls. But Quentin doesn't believe that she believes that hearts are overrated anyway, something that will be well and truly proven throughout the duology. In fact, it'll be proven a bit right now, since Quentin mentions that he always thought that he was meant for more, but his neg rating means he's meant for significantly less, to which Maggie insists that a rating doesn't define a person. Quentin asks her if she really truly believes that, and she nods, but internally, looking into his eyes, she's not quite so sure. I wonder why. When the two arrive at the estate, which literally has its own private river, they take a quick look around and end up in a corner, where Quentin comments on how sinister his opulently decorated home now seems, and Maggie internally comments on how bad the ache in her side is getting. Quentin's father sends for him, which whisks him away, and Maggie is set upon by Sebastian, one of Quentin's older brothers, who starts borderline flirting with her as a test, expressing shock that she isn't interested in him at all before he saunters off to chase a girl he matched well with. Quentin comes back, and so does his mother Eliza, who greets Maggie and points out her odd choice of dress, at which point Maggie finds out that the sales assistant actually gave her a black wedding dress, and she had no clue. They're in the middle of this awkward conversation when the crowd parts at the sound of sirens, revealing a heavily pregnant woman being held by presumably her husband, and another man. Maggie tells us that these sirens, which most people replace the standard 3 beeps with, means a true match. The fact that this woman is already married and pregnant is, to say the least, scandalous. Quentin's father Garrett steps in, taking the single man into a corner while the woman's husband takes her in the other direction. Eliza speculates on what will happen next, mentioning that a true match means to put that person and being with them above all else, saying it's irrefutable, a point Maggie disagrees with. Eliza leaves pretty soon after this to leave the two apparent lovebirds alone. This gives Quentin the perfect chance to take Maggie upstairs and into the computer room. On the way, they have a conversation about how his mum seems surprisingly decent, which Quentin agrees with, mentioning how upset he'll be if she's in on the terrible activities of her husband. In the office, Maggie plugs Gus's transmitter into the computer, and he gains remote access, letting Quentin and Maggie see everything he's going through. This includes things like food resources at critical, and, at the end, population control solutions successful. This really freaks out Maggie and Quentin, and freaks out Gus more, since he tells her to instantly pull the transmitter from the computer, which had full access, putting them in extreme danger if anyone finds out they were there. Maggie starts putting everything back together, basically having a panic attack about what they've seen, and Quentin pulls her aside since she hasn't been responding to his questions. She's also started bleeding through her corset, which definitely isn't a good sign, and she's clearly started dissociating. Or more like, this is YA, so she starts asking him if he ever loved Ivy instead of literally anything relevant to the situation. Quentin says he never did and asks about Gus, who Maggie says she isn't in love with, admitting that she's blackmailing him and that she doesn't actually have any friends or anyone really, which in classic YA or romance in general fashion allows Quentin to do the whole "you have me" thing and kiss her. Lovely. At which point Garrett Mercer walks in on them and Maggie notices she didn't put the mouse back in exactly the right spot. Garrett, in a very sinister way, introduces himself to Maggie and asks about her parents, which she awkwardly answers before he tells her off for not embracing Ferritech, considering she's now involved in the Mercer Empire. Thus continues an interrogation where he asks her about where they're from, how long they've been in town, whether she can dance, and so on, before Quentin extracts them from the conversation and he and his father have a tense verbal confrontation. Garrett tells them to go downstairs and says he expects Quentin's Ferritech on when he makes it down there, and thus they leave, Maggie very pissed at Quentin for kissing her. When they get downstairs, Quentin gets Maggie some water and gives her his jacket, which hides the blood spreading across her corset, and he parks her against a wall while he goes to complete his mandatory dance set up for him with some random girl by his father. Quentin and this girl rate well, him having taken the disruption. And while she's happy, Quentin rolls his eyes at Maggie, making her, of course, feel bad that he isn't taking this genuinely very good rating seriously, believing it to be fake. She starts to consider the future. She'll get the information she needs about her dad, she'll set Quentin up with a fake permanent disruption, and they'll part ways. But as you'd expect, this thought tears her up a bit inside. At this point, a gunshot breaks out and Maggie runs towards it, arriving there in time to see the single man from earlier drop the gun he's holding. The pregnant woman he matched with is cradling her now dead husband. At this point, Garrett, Quentin, Sebastian, and Zachary, his other brother, arrive with security, and when Garrett demands to know what's going on, the woman says she doesn't know and didn't see, which of course Maggie knows is a lie. The single man doesn't dispute this, and the pregnant woman starts lying her ass off about how the single man walked in just a moment ago. Garrett starts to organise everyone when Maggie intervenes, pointing out what really happened. The single man killed the pregnant lady's husband, but Garrett tells Quentin to just take her outside, since she's very clearly drunk and in a state of shock. Quentin tries to back Maggie up, but is shut down by his father, who tells him to get Maggie under control. To which Quentin, borderline breaking the fourth wall, responds, quote, "It's because they're a true match, isn't it?" This shows, very unsubtly, how messed up their current society is. Anyone who rates negatively is shoved in a concentration camp, and true matches are literally excused of murder to be with each other. Back in the car, Maggie refuses to be taken to the hospital, asserting her dominance over Quentin and her complete control, that he should always do whatever she says and to not forget it, at which point he accuses her of only caring about her father and forgetting about the rest of us being the Negs. So she hits back, pointing out how Negs wouldn't even be in this situation if it wasn't for his father and his family, saying how they all make her sick, including him. Good job, Maggie, you terrible person. And Quentin, being the angel he is, despite this insult of being both a neg and a murderous masser, drives Maggie home, helps her out of the car, helps her out of her dress, redoes her dressing, and helps her into bed, the whole time being very respectful of her comfort and privacy, and the whole time being very cautious and conscious of her painful side and arm. I've said it before, I'll say it again, he's a walking green flag. At this point, watching him work, Maggie realises that she has completely and utterly broken him. He's no longer the person he used to be, or even really a person at all. 2 weeks later, Maggie is back training with Master Ra, and comments on how these 2 weeks were torture, being slow and lonely. Both she and Master Ra can tell her goals are no longer as clear, and she doesn't necessarily have the same passion for them. She's changing and unfocused, and it annoys her. Master Ra encourages her to talk to Pre-Evo again, and she refuses. When he refuses to further train her when she's so tired, she snaps back at him, and thus another relationship is destroyed. Gus and Maggie then go to a meeting with Travis, since Travis refuses to meet with Gus if he doesn't have Maggie with him. Oh, you don't remember who Travis is? Me neither. He's Gus's new contact who Maggie kneed in the balls at their first meeting earlier. Maggie's found out about Gus's girlfriend Kelsey and asks if he loves her, to which he says yes and begs her not to bring Kelsey into this. He then suggests that she should go to hell and knows someone stupid enough to follow her, aka Quentin, which Maggie denies, and Gus proposes the wonderful question: if someone had a gun to her father's head and another to Quentin's head and she could only save one, who would she save? A question Maggie dodges, but considering Gus knows that she would have instantly said her father until recently, her lack of an answer is as good as an answer. He also points out how all of the Mercers have DNA access to the main labs, so they need Quentin anyway. To get to Travis, Gus and Maggie have to trek across Theodore Roosevelt Island. They manage to trade some of the information from the Mercer computer with Travis for information about the main tunnels and hubs, when he gets a notification on his phone and tells his friend to activate the mines. Okay. So it turns out that coincidentally the island is being raided, and they all have to skedaddle before the mines go off or they'll get killed. Gus gets hit by an explosion and is alive but unconscious, so Maggie and Travis have to carry him out. They swim him across the river and get to a car of Travis's, which they drive away in while the island blows up. As part of a conversation Maggie and Travis have, Travis mentions that he helped her carry Gus because he likes her mentality of never leaving a man behind, and knows that he may one day be that man, not wanting to be left behind. The next day, Travis gives them the information and money he owes them, and they prepare to break into the central hub. Maggie knows that if something goes wrong, she may not make it out, so she goes to visit her brother Sam before she leaves, giving him lots of money to use if she's not back in a few days. He's obviously not thrilled about this. As much as he's an absent brother who doesn't have any aspirations in life, he does actually love her, and is horrified that she might be going to get herself killed, but she leaves before he can do anything. Maggie heads home, wondering how she's going to get a DNA sample from Quentin when she stumbles in on him in her room anyway. He quickly figures out where she's going and demands to come with her, which of course she refuses. This leads to an argument in which he reveals that he couldn't care less about the disruption if she doesn't come out alive. Oh dear. But I do love the section that comes next. Quote, "Silence followed his words. They dropped like a bomb and we both just stood there, dumbfounded, as we watched the smoke and debris clear. But that kind of smoke lingers." Just so funny. Literal bomb, Quentin. Or, as Maggie calls him from this point on, Quinn. I have to say, I do like the naming in this series. For instance, Garrett sounds high class and distant, Gus sounds like your average Joe, Maggie comes from Margaret, an old-fashioned name which is interesting in a high-tech near-future society, and Quentin is, well, a fancy name, but one that is shortened in the duology to Quinn, or by his shallow female friends as Quinny. Two names which are typically, to my knowledge, feminine, which I think really helps show how he's a much softer character than the audience and Maggie expected, and also how he's got a much softer personality than Maggie in general. It's nice to see, you know. Anyway, they, or more like Quentin, eventually decide that if she's going back down, Quentin will come with her. They start studying the maps they have, and Quentin has seemingly been given free rein to become flirty by his previous bombshell, and by Maggie reluctantly agreeing to him coming, making tons of comments about he's worthless but he's still fallen for her and he loves her and so on and so on. Let me give you a hilariously depressing example. He says, quote, "If we'd never met, I'd just be a neg. But now I'm a neg who knows what I'll never have, even though I want it more than anything." Oh dear. I know I've said it too many times, but poor guy. And thus they make out. This is a YA romance after all. They go to Gus's house to stay the night, but he's with Kelsey and not in the mood to deal with them, so he shoots Maggie with a tranq gun before slamming the door in their face. Yes, this is really weird, but it's a real scene that actually happened. While she's out, Maggie dreams about the diner again. Her father has been dosing Beth with positive disruption every Thursday, and she's been enjoying a greatly improved social and work life. But this time, Maggie wants to do the dose, only when she does, Beth starts rating negatively with everyone instead, and Maggie and her dad leave before Beth gets carted off by the police. This terrifies 16-year-old Maggie, and her father tells her they can't say anything about it. Maggie wakes up in a very comfortable bed, which seemingly keeps her in a half-sleep state, in which she and Quentin can have a very open conversation, which of course becomes very awkward when she realizes she's not dreaming. She has a shower, they spoon in bed, and she goes to sleep. But not before they have a very intimate conversation about their fears for tomorrow, about Quentin being a neg and about Quentin being in love with her, and in which Maggie almost tells him the truth, but of course does not. During this conversation, Quentin also declares that he's madly in love with her, would die for her, and would kill for her. Lovely. He also says, and I quote, "I didn't give you those words. You ripped them from my heart and soul, and now they're yours forever." After which, Maggie thinks to herself, oh my god. Which, like, yeah, this guy is going to have a long way to fall. On a more important thematic note, at this point, Maggie notes that Quentin was always a believer in the system and now is questioning it, while she was always skeptical of it and is now in love with him. The next day they drive to Dulles International Airport, with lots of flirting on the way, and at the airport pay off a security guard already known to them to let them through, then run along the luggage conveyor belt to the tunnels. This gives Quentin yet another chance to question his knowledge of the world, since Maggie reveals to him that M-Corp have been creating and shipping out black market M-band drugs and other products which they publicly denounce, to make more money of course. They make their way through the tunnels. I'll spare you the nitty-gritty details, but basically they fight some guards, do lots of flirting, and so on. When they get close to the main lab, Quentin stops her and expresses his concern that he'll take the permanent disruption and he and Maggie might not rate well with each other, basically saying he doesn't want it if they can't be together, which causes Maggie to involuntarily tell him she loves him, of course. A phrase he never thought he'd hear since he knew he was a neg. Maggie brushes this conversation off by promising him that they'll rate better than he could imagine, something she's sure of because she's already seen it. Don't forget I told you to remember something from the start of the book. Do you remember an hour later? They get into the main lab and Maggie gets to work while Quentin keeps an eye out. Maggie's on the phone to Gus, having a minor mental breakdown about how much she's tortured Quentin, and Gus has to tell her to pull herself together. He then realizes that the population control document they saw previously was about M-Corp offering countries, at a high price of course, a population control method which would stop their population from breeding, one that's planned to be used in third world countries. This disruption is so powerful that it doesn't just disrupt their chemical signals, it turns them truly negative, with a 90% success rate, mirroring insecticides. At this point someone comes along and Maggie and Quentin hide, Maggie panicking. She blurts out a few things on the border of confessing, saying that she did something horrible to him and sacrificed him before she even knew him. But before she can finish, the lab door opens and someone comes in. The man tells them to come out before the others get there, and Maggie stands up, coming face to face with her father. Can we get a boom noise here? Yeah, so this whole time Maggie's dad has been a scientist working for M-Corp and never needed saving, and when she looks in his eyes now, she can't find any love for herself in them. Quentin grabs Maggie to leave, but her father, who has a gun, points it at her, making the correct assessment that Quentin will behave so long as the gun is pointed at Maggie. Romance life. This also makes Maggie realize that her father thinks that if he pointed the gun at Quentin, Maggie wouldn't try to save him. At this point, Maggie's father admits that he's been watching her the whole time and basically could have quashed her quest at any point, but decided not to out of curiosity. He also tells her that Travis was actually in league with him and gave him information about her. When Quentin interrupts to ask what he's going on about, Maggie's villain father monologues about his brilliant plan of reducing populations in third world countries to improve resource statuses, and reveals to Quentin that he isn't actually a neg and that the disruption Maggie was giving him was fake. This leads him to demand that she turns on her Ferritech, a demand which ends up surprising both him and her father, as when they both connect, 3 beeps go off. What did you expect? They're a true match. What a shocker. But Quentin is shocked and mentions to Maggie that it was never his beliefs about the system being adjusted, it was hers. I'm sure you're smart enough to figure this out by yourself, but I'll explain it anyway because 11-year-old me definitely did not understand this for whatever reason. But I do love this moment. You know how I told you to remember that thing at the start of the book? Yeah, at the start of the book, Maggie and Quentin's M-bands connected unexpectedly while his was being linked, so only she and Gus registered the fact that they were a true match. Both she and Gus have known this entire time, hence him teasing her about how dreamy Quentin is, and her being so concerned about the fact that she was falling in love with him. This is exactly what Quentin is talking about when he says that her beliefs were being changed, not his. He always believed in the system, hence why he was so quick to believe that him being a neg must make him a terrible person. But Maggie didn't believe in the system and was determined not to. Hence, she became more and more frustrated over time as she did indeed begin to fall in love with him, and began to realize that actually, yes, their true match status was correct, and her brain didn't matter compared to her pheromone glands and heart. Now, the interesting thing about this is that on your first read, you have no clue what the 3 beeps at the start of the book are. Even when they're mentioned at the ball later, you, like I did on my first read, might have forgotten about them at the start, which makes this final reveal more surprising, which also makes the first time reading experience confusing. But when you know they're a true match from the start, and that's what the 3 beeps are, you start to notice so many other things. Gus's odd reactions, him teasing Maggie, and Maggie repeatedly doing her best to deny the fact that she's falling in love with Quentin. Sure, this makes the first read around a bit confusing, and you could argue that the confusion takes away from the reader's enjoyment of the book and thus indicates bad writing, but you could also argue the fact that these semi-hidden details in the book give the book new meaning and depth and give it a lot of rereadability, which makes it better and more enjoyable. I certainly have enjoyed rereading this book and finding more details over and over and over. Anyway, think what you want of it, because after this happens, Maggie does her best to apologise to Quentin, saying she was wrong, which of course he isn't keen on. At this point, guards enter the room. Maggie announces that Quentin is her prisoner and has been working for her under duress, telling the guards not to harm him, and one of them tells her father that Garrett is on the way. As he's being led away, Quentin also implies to the guards that if they hurt Maggie, they'll have him and his fancy surname to answer to. Maggie gets shot with a tranq and is out. When she wakes up, she's in a grey cement cell with only a bed and a toilet. Garrett Mercer is there with her, gloating over her, and he tells her that she's been out for a full day and admonishes her for turning Quentin against his family, something she argues against, saying that he didn't need her to know the difference between right and wrong. Maggie asks what's going to happen to her, and Garrett says that he, fancying himself an artist, wants to come to an artistic decision, which could take some time. With that, he leaves and the lights are turned off. Maggie can't track the time with no light, sounds, or windows, and this uncertainty is worse than the public execution she was expecting. As she says herself, she has had plenty of time to consider all of the negs she left behind. Every bad thing she's done, how poorly she treated Gus and Quentin, and so on. She gets very little food, and one day they give her stew, which is of course too rich and makes her throw up. She keeps trying to do laps of the cell but ends up collapsing eventually, as starved of food and water as she is. But MCorp won't let her die and give her just enough food for her to not die. One day her M-band, which has been disconnected, beeps, showing the message, "Never forget, I know that you know," which means nothing to you, because you've been listening to me recounting the story. But this is what Quentin said to Maggie after confessing his love to her, so presumably this is a message from him saying he still loves her in some way. This absolutely destroys Maggie, but she keeps going, considering the possibility that Quentin is being held down here too. With the last line of the book, she promises to herself to make right everything she's made wrong, which is primarily Quentin, and to a lesser extent her family, Gus, and the Negs. And that's the end of the first book. Before we discuss the second one, let's take a moment to recap the themes and the ups and downs of Disruption. Let's start with my thoughts as I expressed them right after rereading the book in my book journal. Here's what I wrote. The book had a lot of extra depth that I hadn't previously noticed, partially because of my terrible reading comprehension skills when I first read it, and partially because of my knowledge having read this series previously. This was referring to the knowledge of the 3 beeps being a true match, stuff like that. The book was far better written and thought out than I expected for a YA dystopian romance, and I did feel that it had at least a few things to say about society, especially about how quickly everyone just accepted the new technology and regime. I had a lot of fun rereading it. There were, of course, some issues and plot holes, and it wasn't a literary masterpiece, hence why I gave it 3 out of 5, but overall I enjoyed it. I found the characters generally enjoyable, and although Maggie definitely could have been better written, especially with all of the pointless self-pity being not like other girls and hating other girls/women, I thought it was nice and fun to have such a terrible person be the main character. I picked up on a lot more of her manipulation this time around, and it was horrible. I felt so bad for Quentin. Also, this read-through made me realise how great Quentin is and how men written by women he is. I had a lot of fun. Thank you, past Casper. So yeah, to elaborate on the above, overall I think this is a fun book, and like I said, considering it was a YA dystopian romance, a notoriously poorly written genre, and I was convinced I'd been viewing it through rose-tinted glasses, I was pleasantly surprised to see how, relative to the rest of the genre, it was well written, and unlike most YA dystopian novels, actually had more interesting themes to consider. For instance, it mentions, with varying levels of depth, crowd mentality and groupthink, propaganda, the oppression of minority groups, class hierarchies, the nature of technology and technological advancement, the dangers of obsessions with science, the danger of adopting and becoming obsessed with new trends too quickly, surveillance societies, artificiality versus reality, and the nature of fate, and whether we have free will or can choose our own destiny. All of these are really interesting themes, and like I said, although they weren't all executed well or given the depth they deserved, they were still present, and that's a lot more than you can say for most YA dystopias. For instance, themes like societal obsessions and surveillance societies weren't done justice, I think. The book critiques how, as a society, we become obsessed with often shallow things too quickly, and forget about real connection, but it largely does this through treating the people of these societies as stupid and shallow, which is unproductive. This is something well seen through the representation of women, but we'll get to that later. Additionally, surveillance societies are present. I mean, they are literally living in a surveillance society which uses technology to track literally everything about you. And this is portrayed as a negative thing, but only because Maggie is doing illegal stuff. The rest of the book consistently frames this surveillance as largely a good thing, saying that the rates of teen sex and pregnancies are down and that there are fewer STDs, and implying that barriers to relationships and friendships have been lowered and there's less conflict in society, since people only introduce themselves to and spend time with the people they rate well with. It's very odd, and this, the surveillance and matching technology being treated as good, is reinforced in the second book, which, spoiler alert, ends with the technology staying around. Literally, it doesn't get removed, only slightly altered. This could have been framed as Maggie seeing the truth of the technology, and I do think that was the intention, but considering the wealth of evidence she gives us that it's actually had a positive impact, and considering what happens at the end of the second book, this just falls a bit flat. Speaking of a thematic disconnect between the technology being good and bad is the theme of self-determination or destiny. The matching technology implies that people can't pick their own destiny. Whatever the numbers say you and your relationships are, that's what you are. This is the primary theme of the book and is the primary character struggle Maggie experiences. She deeply believes that the ratings are wrong, or at least that they don't dictate a person's life, but she's consistently finding out how actually her 100% rating with Quentin seems far more true each day. So here we have another disconnect. Society and M-Corp tell Maggie that the ratings are true and are destiny, but Maggie fights against this. A primary example of this is the Negs. Maggie points out how many of them were locked up before even having the chance to do anything wrong because of society's obsession with the numbers, and she mentions how many of them only became bad people because of their horrible conditions, which created a fight or flight response. But we later find out that a good chunk of the Negs are false Negs, and the data presented at the beginning of the book suggests that Negs were actually predisposed to being criminals. So all of the evidence points to the ratings being right about people. Real Negs are actually bad people. True matches are actually perfect for each other no matter what, and all of the ratings in between are true. You might say, but Maggie and Ivy were supposed to be friends and Maggie hates her. Just wait for book 2, man. By the end of the second book, every single true rating that was given turns out to be correct and dictates the course of that relationship, with the sole exception of Maggie's parents. So the theme Maggie consistently spouts throughout the book, and what Quentin starts to believe under her manipulation, turns out to be false anyway. This is insane. I think this theme would have been far better explored with a single simple change. Make Maggie and Quentin actually have a negative relationship rating. And if you want to take it further, make all of the Negs, even the nice ones, true Negs. The primary change this would create is that what is an interesting thematic consideration from Quentin's perspective, the fact that he supposedly has a negative rating with this girl but still loves her anyway, becomes an actual point of thematic interest and isn't thrown out at the end of the book by their true match status. If Quentin and Maggie had been able to fight through the numbers and show the power of a true connection outside of the technology, this book would have been an interesting one about following your heart and creating your own destiny, but instead they all follow their destiny to a T. Honestly, the handling of this is my single biggest problem with the book. I have major issues with the next theme too, but at the end of the day this is a romance, so the romance issues are more salient. Another theme related to this that is clumsily handled is the mistreatment of minority groups. You may or may not have noticed, but the Negs are a poorly disguised Holocaust allegory. The propaganda, the rehabilitation farms that are actually places of torture, being held in horrible conditions and being cleansed, being used as forced cheap labour and disposed of if they're not useful, population control, medical experiments, society being complacent, being falsely accused of being a neg, being portrayed as non-human, being tracked, singled out and arrested in the name of creating a better world, anyone associated with them being ostracised, being branded with a number code. All of these things may not be exclusive to the Holocaust, but together they certainly reference that historical event above all others. And it gets even more obvious in the second book. Now, on the bright side, this does send the message that eugenics are wrong, which is a good message, but on the downside, like I said, this is clumsily handled. To begin with, you could argue whether it's even ethical to have a Holocaust allegory in a YA romance, and you could argue that there are some disturbing implications of that being translated to things like Maggie convincing Quentin he's a neg, Maggie leaving negs behind, and even the nature of the word neg itself, which realistically would count as a slur. But a far more explicit bad implication of this is the fact that all of the evidence tells us that true negs are legitimately bad people. So does that make their imprisonment and extermination justified? Jewish people aren't inherently bad, but negs are, scientifically. And that's just a weird detail to put in this Holocaust allegory. This theme would have been far better explored by the hypothetical plot changes I mentioned earlier, such as Quentin actually being a neg and lots of negs not actually being bad people. This would reinforce the Holocaust allegory in an actually historically accurate way, that many innocents are being horribly tortured and killed for no reason other than to support a tyrannical regime. It also would have been interesting to have the main love interest be part of this marginalised group, an in-your-face example of how negs are just regular people, not horrible criminals. But no, Quentin just had to be Maggie's true match, and all true negs just had to be scientifically terrible people. As clumsy as this is though, there is a positive side of this allegory, the exploration of propaganda and its uses. We see often in the book how propaganda is consistently used by MCorp to justify their activities. The first example of this is the idyllic image of the rehabilitation farm, clearly a show concentration camp replacement, right down to the farming and playing games. We also get more of this later, primarily through Quentin, who shows the insane effect this propaganda has on society. He can't even fathom the idea that negs are being treated poorly and killed without seeing it himself. And even after seeing things like this, he can't imagine the rehabilitation farms being bad places, and he struggles to think of his parents and his mum especially as bad people. It's really interesting to see this effect of propaganda, and through Quentin, the book shows how pervasive propaganda can become, the intense effects it can have, and why it's bad, primarily through leading to division, discrimination, complacency, and a lack of critical thinking and justice. So good on you for that one, Shervington. And from what I can see, lots of historians and other people think that the propaganda used during the Holocaust is one of the most important things to remember and recognise, as that same rhetoric becomes more and more common in the modern world. So it's good that this book has shown its audience, at least implicitly, how to recognise and challenge some of that. So now that we're talking about arguably more well-handled themes, let's also talk about class hierarchies. Outside of the romance, a good chunk of the book discusses class hierarchies in some way or another. This starts pretty much from the first page, where Maggie and Quentin are explicitly contrasted. Quentin, being uber rich, is shielded from the worst of society and is shielded from many of the ugly truths of the world he lives in. For instance, he's never seen a neg being arrested before. But while others in the train station have to distance themselves from the neg and the drama, potentially out of fear of being singled out and accused of also being negs, Quentin has the freedom to appear interested, and potentially to even intervene without being locked up too. He also has the freedom and financial power needed to break free from society's surveillance to a certain extent. For instance, every single M-band has a GPS, right? But you can buy a thing called a Haze, which does exactly what it says. Hazes your GPS location. These hazes are mega expensive and I think also illegal, but Quentin has one because he's rich, you know? Even though Maggie needs one far more for her illegal activities, she could never even hope to afford one. Second, the fact that negs seem to be largely taken from the middle and working classes. There's a suggestion, however faint, that upper class families can shield their own from the nature of being a neg. So not only are negs taken from the middle and lower classes, but those families then have to deal with reduced income from now arrested family members, and have to deal with massive social stigma and ostracization. And on top of that, they have to settle all of the negs' debts, and the government is introducing a new poverty tax for goodness knows what public reason, which will keep the lower classes even lower and will let the upper classes rise even higher. And on top of that, there's M-Corp. M-Corp is a company that was already rich, right? But through introducing a technology that everyone liked and proposing its usefulness in surveillance and controlling crime to the government, they were able to get this technology, which is invasive with a chip literally embedded in the spinal cord, literally mandated for every citizen and temporary resident. This means that M-Corp 1 gains tons of money and gets even richer, and 2 gains tons of control over society. And they manipulate this even more. M-Corp controls the supply of both legal M-band products and illegal products like lust enhancers. This means that they, like I said, have total control, and can also control the quantity and prices of products as they see fit, putting them even further ahead of the rest of society and widening the wealth gap. Throughout the book, we see the massive wealth gap in society and how the rich have the privilege of not needing to care about injustices, while the poor are directly affected. This is also seen through the neg hubs, which, on top of being Holocaust allegories, also likely reference the broken prison system in the US and other countries, with a high representation of lower class people, with poor justice and a lack of proper trial, with police brutality, psychological torture, and other mistreatment, and with forced prison labour, as negs are borderline forced to become part of the military. Another thing I think this book does well is show the dangers of idolizing people. Maggie absolutely adores and idolizes her father and goes to all of these insane and illegal lengths in an attempt to save him, only for him to turn out to be a bad person. It's a cautionary tale about being too obsessed with someone you actually don't know that well, and obviously extends to parasocial relationships. I mean, this is a largely K-pop channel, of course I'd bring up parasocial relationships. Now, I want to mention a few things that aren't themes but are still worth mentioning as issues I had with this book. First, the book is plot-driven, not character-driven. For those who don't know, a character-driven book has the plot driven by character actions which are understandable considering that character's goals and personality. But a plot-driven book will occasionally just kind of mold characters into whatever they need to be to allow a certain scene to happen. Although Disruption has its fair share of character-driven moments, namely Maggie's manipulation of Quentin, it also has some awful coincidences and moments that are almost certainly more plot-driven than character-driven. For instance, Maggie taking Quentin to her own house after the first underground trip together. This doesn't seem like something Maggie would do. She's a very cautious and secretive person and needs to always be in control. You could argue this is a sign of her already falling in love with Quentin, but even so, she still distrusts him and wants to push him away. It makes zero sense for her to take him to her house instead of a park or something, because then he knows the location of her house, which is a very vulnerable position for her to put herself in for no reason. In terms of coincidences, we have the fact that she and Quentin are within a few months' age of each other, living in the same city, and close enough that Maggie can go to the same school as him. Like, what are the chances she's the same age in the same location as the most kind-hearted and open of the three Mercer heirs? Also, the Mercer ball. Like, what are the chances it happens only a few weeks after Maggie enacts her plan? And why didn't she already know about this likely very public and high media coverage event? Surely she would have included it in her plans. There's several moments like this which just don't seem normal and they really take you out of the plot. Another one that I only noticed when I was recording this video is that Gus says that finding a new contact will take months, and then Travis shows up like literally within 2 days. Second, Maggie not being like other girls, and the hatred of girls in the story. This is a common 2010s YA thing, and honestly, Maggie is far from the worst in terms of YA protagonists, but it's still cringy if nothing else. The number of times Maggie says borderline the same things as literally every stereotypical not like other girls story is insane. She talks about her hasty ponytail and not wanting to spend time on her hair. She talks about wearing pretty much only jeans. She talks about her plain face in comparison to her mother's beauty, even though they have the same facial features. She talks about not liking dresses and not liking to dress up, but of course she's mega hot and mega attractive when she does. She doesn't really know how to use makeup. She likes black and hates pink. She buys weapons magazines, not fashion ones. She isn't falling over the boys. She doesn't have big boobs. She isn't shallow and silly and doesn't call Quentin silly pet names, although she does make the move to calling him Quinn at the end of the book. She's rude, not silly and cute. She doesn't know how to use bobby pins outside of picking locks. She likes martial arts. She doesn't go to parties and doesn't care about her ratings, even though really she does. She's effortlessly smart, even though she's not. And she has a sense of justice. Even with that super long list, I could go on. Speaking of, unlike other girls, Maggie hates other girls. Lovely. Well, of course, she doesn't say that she hates other girls, but there are two things that make me come to this conclusion. First, the vast majority of important or even side characters in the story are men. Women not being salient in a story is one way to make women seem less meaningful or important. Let's just think about the important or side characters. There's Quentin and Gus, obviously, and then Maggie's father, who has motivated her entire journey. There's also Garrett Mercer, the main villain, and Travis and his gang of male goons. Moving into side characters, there's Maggie's brother, Quentin's brothers and friend Morris, and Master Ra. The only female side characters relevant after the end of the first book are Maggie's mum and Quentin's mum, Eliza. Maggie's mum, who I don't actually think ever gets a name, is constantly overworked, and although she's framed as kind and hardworking, she's a borderline absent parent figure, and is criticised by Maggie for 1. Not taking Maggie seriously, and 2. Not caring about finding her father. Shervington also portrays Maggie as having to look after and protect her mother, portraying her mum as a weak person. Now, Eliza is portrayed as a somewhat shallow lady who largely cares about decorating her house, since Quentin thinks she's mourning the fact that she has no daughters. Eliza is probably the most kind portrayal of another woman in the book. She's generally kind and has a sense of humour, and although she is hanging on the arm of and presumably supporting the main villain and is maintaining the injustice of society, she's massively complimented by Quentin, saying that he believes she's a good person. Now, on to other characters. The only other mentioned female characters in this book, as far as I'm aware, are the librarian who Maggie can blackmail and who is portrayed as a weak-willed cat lady type, even though she owns a dog, Maggie's co-worker Stella, who is obsessed with her boobs and social trends, Ivy, who is also portrayed as shallow, booby, and obsessed with men, and Quentin's unnamed female friends at the mall who call him Quinny and are shallowly obsessed with the latest trends and obsessed with Quinny. Maggie mentally degrades all of these women, and she consistently degrades the other NPC women in society who wear large, colourful, and fashionable gowns, in comparison to Maggie, who, well, likes black. There's also Kelsey, who we never meet, who is used as borderline blackmail material for Gus. Mia, who is the shop assistant who helps Maggie get a ball gown, portrayed as a nice person but only in a single scene. And Sarah, the neg Maggie tries to help escape. Sarah is another positively portrayed girl and is suggested to be almost a kindred spirit for Maggie, but she's dead within a few pages, so yeah. Not a great track record for representing women, this book. But on the bright side, it gets better in the next one. I shouldn't need to tell you why representing women poorly and excluding women from the story in general is a bad thing. It perpetuates societal norms that women aren't as important or salient as men, aren't necessary for things to get done, and that feminine things are bad. It encourages division between women, which only leads to internalized misogyny and further harm, and it's led to a lot of women and girls avoiding things they want to do because they feel the need to appear more masculine lest they be teased. There's literally no reason for women to hate other women, and if you're someone who hates women because of reasons like the above, being shallow, unintelligent, obsessed with men and trends, etc., may I encourage you to challenge that belief, because I can practically guarantee to you that 99% of girls and women, even the ones who appear shallow or even are shallow, are still perfectly nice and normal people. I used to hate women, partially because of societal messages and partially because most of the people who had hurt me in my life were women. And honestly, once I worked on my own biases, started challenging my assumptions, and started not thinking of women and feminine things as instantly stupid and shallow, and started thus making friends with more women and talking to women more, my life became so much better. Women are the best, and Ivy seems like a girl's girl. So I've discussed a bunch of the themes in this book and whether I thought they were well or poorly handled, and I've mentioned my overall thoughts on the book, which I gave a 3 out of 5. So it was fun, but it definitely had its downsides. Let's take a quick look at the public opinion on this book, seen through the Goodreads reviews. On Goodreads, at time of writing this script, Disruption has 3,726 ratings and 543 reviews. The majority of these are 5 and 4 stars, 568 or 42%, and 1,400 or 37% respectively. There were 583 star ratings, or 15%, 137 2-star ratings, or 3%, and 41 or 1% 1-star ratings, for an average of 4.16 stars. The first review is from March 2014, and the most recent is from literally yesterday when I wrote this, May 7th, 2025. The person wrote, YA in the style of Bella pines for Edward, but instead of evil vampire family, we have evil tech family. The non-pining part moves along nicely. Which, fair, you know. I also liked this comment from 2024, which I thought was nicely well-rounded, talking about the M-bands being an interesting topic and Maggie being, quote, delightfully ruthless. But they also criticised how Maggie lost her edge after finding romance, and how the characters were often focusing too much on romance during life or death situations, which I definitely agree with. Now, speaking of generally positive reviews, most of the positive reviews talk about the exciting plot and secrets, and talk about how interesting the science fiction nature of the world is. A lot of people also mentioned Maggie being a strong protagonist, although most people mentioned it in terms of her being a badass and a knowledgeable female protagonist, as opposed to people like this one, who, like me, were brilliantly horrified by the, quote, utter mindfuck that Maggie pulls over on Quentin. A lot of people also talked about it being action-packed and talked about what a twist the ending was, and there were lots of compliments for the romance, of course. I also saw a few reviews from people who, like me, had read it when it first came out and were rereading and re-enjoying it, so it was fun to see me not alone. Now, in terms of more negative reviews, most of the reviews complain about Maggie as a character and about her hating other girls. I've talked about both of these things, and I definitely agree that her hating other girls and women is a huge issue with the book, but I also think that it's unfortunately a product of its time. I can definitely agree with these people. What I can't really agree with is all of the people who complain and say they didn't like the book because, quote, Maggie's a bad person. Yes, I can agree with the people who say that her character development was a bit odd and repetitive and that they didn't like her actions, but the people who just straight up say the book is bad because Maggie isn't a good person, like, guys, did you miss the entire point of her character? At least at the start of the book? She's not supposed to be a good person, and she's not supposed to be a likable person. Honestly, I think people not reading the book because they don't like the main character is odd. If you only read books where you like and fully relate to the main character, I mean, you can do that. We all have our own reading preferences, but I think you're really missing out. Once upon a time, I talked to someone who would only even consider reading books with main characters that were the same age and gender as them because they felt like they couldn't relate to any other characters, which made me sad. Anyway, point is, I personally feel like complaining about how terrible Maggie is shows a lack of reading comprehension, and complaining about how selfish she is to not work with Pre-Evo and to not use her evidence on the neg hubs to help negs as a whole is, well, a reasonable complaint about her as a person, but not a reasonable complaint about her as a character, because it's very character consistent and is like the big character-driven plot point in the book. In fact, I think Maggie being a terrible person is one of the best things about the book, and she's not terrible enough. These complaints about Maggie and her hating girls are the two biggest issues people have with the book. Some people also complain about the plot being odd, possibly because a lot of people seemingly expected this to be a sci-fi book, not a romance, so they probably expected said sci-fi elements to be a larger part of the plot. Another complaint with the plot that a lot of people have, which I think is really fair, is Maggie's father. He says that he's been watching her the whole time and could have stopped her literally whenever he wanted to, but decided to let her keep going for, I don't know, curiosity's sake? And thus let her break into one of the most important labs in the country. I guess it makes sense if you consider that he's curious about the possibilities, but it's so odd for him and Garrett to just sit there and let this happen. I think it would have been better, if potentially less realistic, if they didn't know, but were still powerful enough to shut her down when they found her in the central hub. There's also this incredibly long and, in my opinion, borderline unhinged rant, which talks about how the science behind pheromones in this book is absolutely fudged, and how unrealistic it is, even bringing in borderline Freudian concepts like children matching with their parents, and generally overanalyzing something that, in my opinion, is a pretty harmless part of the world building. Like, yeah, scientific inaccuracies in sci-fi books are annoying, but like, the point of this book isn't whether it's scientifically accurate. The point of this book is that we shouldn't be dictated by technology. The lack of accuracy doesn't at all, in my opinion, take away from the quality of the work, although a scientifically accurate world would certainly show greater attention to detail. This person basically complains about everything to do with the book. Quentin is boring, unrealistic, and weirdly possessive. The romance is weird and rushed. There's no way Garrett Mercer would notice Maggie was up to something just by seeing how the mouse on his computer was slightly off-center. Maggie's dad is unrealistic, and so on and so on. They also complained about the matching system to begin with, but I think that's because they expected it to be more like Matched, where the government picks your partner, than what it actually was, where the people in society have more agency. This person also gave Matched 5 stars and left a review saying it was a really interesting and unique book with good characters. Like, how did you give Disruption 1 star and Matched 5 stars? In my opinion, Matched made even less sense as a world, and the main character was super boring, but, you know, we all have our own opinions, I guess. And I think that this person's opinion is that they're a certified Disruption hater. And honestly, yes, all of these things are valid points, and this person clearly just couldn't handle the build-up of all of these things, which were far bigger issues to them than to most people and to myself. And, you know, we all have the right to not read books as we see fit. In fact, I've put down 2 books this year so far because of issues I had with the characters and plot. But, like, this is a YA dystopian novel. We probably shouldn't expect it to be a masterpiece. I feel like they were just completely unable to suspend their disbelief and took the book way more seriously than it should have been taken. And although I personally think this review showed a lack of reading comprehension, both in their inability to understand what the book was trying to say and in terms of being unable or unwilling to meet the book on its own terms, honestly, I've seen far, far worse. Primarily in the reviews of a book called Fathom Folk. Gosh, the reviews under that book are terrible. Anyway, that was an interesting look at the reviews of Disruption. To summarise, as with most books, many people's final interpretations are different based on their personal preference and the expectations they had for that book, and also whether they're able to personally look past the problems with a book or not. I and many others were clearly able to look past the many problems with Disruption, although many people who gave it 5 stars possibly lacked the reading comprehension and experience to even notice these things, and others were unable to look past these issues, hence negative reviews. So now that we've looked at Disruption and discussed the positives and negatives of the book, and my own and others' thoughts and reviews, let's look at the sequel. Maggie's wasting away in prison and she has no clue what Garrett's going to do to punish her. Maggie doesn't know if her family or Quentin are safe. She no longer has a purpose in life after her father has turned out to be an evil racial supremacist. So what will happen to the Negs? And most importantly of all, will Quentin be able to forgive Maggie? Will they finally get together forever? Are you ready to get back into this? I have mixed feelings. We start off on a bad note with a quote supposedly from Gus saying, quote, "I'm going to tell you a story about a girl who lost her dad and had her world fall apart. And then I'm going to tell you the story about the woman she became." Ugh, mega pretentious YA style. Into the actual content, Maggie is still in the cell in the bowels of the M-Corp system, being slowly starved and given only enough food to survive. This means not only is she slowly losing strength, she's also losing the energy to think properly. She says the only thing keeping her going is the thought that Quentin is the only one who has the right to destroy her, hence she won't let M-Corp do it. Hilariously enough, this is editing, Casper. I just noticed in my script that instead of M-Corp, I wrote Mnet here. So that shows you what I think of Mnet. Alright, back into it. So talking about Maggie. She's also become extremely paranoid about the food she's stashed under her bed. 1 energy bar and half a bottle of water. At this point, 2 M-Corp guards show up and, complaining about how much she stinks, they load her into a transit pod and give her some sunglasses, which are crucial since she's been in the dark for weeks and her eyes are super sensitive. These guards also turn out to be Negs. Fun fact. Maggie is so disoriented she can't even think of an escape plan during the pod journey, and she arrives at another junction where some new guards pick her up and her M-band starts reactivating after being turned off for weeks. She's having a lot of problems walking and is having a semi-permanent panic attack, which isn't making life easy for either her or the guards. She gets loaded into a jeep, driven through the city, and deposited in front of her house. Odd, right? Maggie finds out she was held underground for 4 weeks, and the first thing she does is go upstairs and find a box of choc chip cookies to dig into. This scene is pretty well written in my opinion, in that it expresses the desperation of her food that Maggie has developed while being starved, and how nothing else matters. For instance, she's so desperate to get into the bag of cookies that she tears the whole thing open, and a bunch of them fall out. But she shoves some in her mouth anyway before bending down to pick them up, and she stuffs more in her mouth as she collects them from the floor. This is completely understandable, considering, well, her having been starved. She then has a drink and gets a chance to look at herself. She's dirty, gaunt, sallow, and covered in blood, sweat, vomit, and more. She says she smells feral and her eyes are dull, which is pretty depressing. Hence, she has a shower, spending tons of time appreciating the warm water and thinking about why they would possibly let her go, and what to do next. She even considers whether Gus could be in her father's pocket or whether he'll even still be around. Having cleaned herself appropriately and cut off a bunch of her matted hair, Maggie grabs the cookies and heads downstairs, where she conveniently overhears her brother Sam and her mum arguing about what to do about her, discussing whether they can contact relatives, find her father, etc. Maggie steps out into the kitchen and obviously surprises them, and they get a chance to see how terrible she looks and how possessive she currently is over food. The two reveal that they knew that her dad was conducting questionable experiments, to say the least, and that he was obsessed with said experiments, but that they didn't tell her because she idolized him so much and they didn't want to ruin her positive memory of her father. Unfortunate, that one. But they sort out their miscommunications and they discuss how weird it is that MCorp just let Maggie go. Maggie tries to convince them to leave, saying she can't come with them since she's being tracked, and Sam reluctantly agrees. Maggie then decides the next most important thing is finding Quentin. Did you forget? This is a YA romance, guys. So she decides to go to school, where she gets some curious looks. She's greeted at her locker by Quentin's friend Morris, who tells her that he's missed seeing her around, that he likes her glasses, and that she should take it easy. Maggie isn't allowed to take a bag to the classroom, but of course she needs food, so she shoves some cookies in her pocket and heads to class, where she asks her seat neighbour Gabriella about Quentin. Very unsubtly. Gabriella says she's sorry to hear about Quentin and Maggie's breakup, and through further questioning, Gabriella liking to gossip, Maggie finds out that Quentin's been running around with his Ferrotech on, and that there are tons of rumours about Maggie, including that she was bribing Quentin to keep his tech off in return for sex, and that she was a money digger. Maggie quickly decides that Quentin was the one who spread these rumours about her, and thus he must hate her. Okay, sure, I guess. At this point, speak of the devil, Quentin walks in arm with Ivy, and dressed nicely and in perfect health. Of course, you know, he has all the money and power, so of course he's perfectly fine, while Maggie has literally been tortured. This knowledge throws Maggie into another... I'm not sure if it's a panic attack, but I'll say panic attack for the sake of easy communication. She goes to leave when a bunch of security guards come in to guard Quentin, and thus decides to stay, all the while being tortured by the fact that Quentin hasn't once even glanced in her direction. But before the class starts, a teacher comes in and collects all of the students who had been at the rating in the first book, including Ivy, Quentin, and Maggie. Maggie knows this can't be good. As they walk down the hallway, Quentin leaves Ivy briefly to talk to Maggie, delivering this epic line. Quote, "You'll end up exactly where you're destined to. I can promise you that. I just want you to remember, no matter what you think you know, and after all you did, I know that you know, and that is all that matters." And thus he heads off to hold hands with Ivy. Oof. It's not so much the content of what he said that makes me say oof, it's the way it was delivered. Like straight ice. Maggie assumes this is Quentin's way to torture her by throwing previously loving lines harshly back in her face. But like, guys, this is a YA romance. Anyway, they're taken to the hall where they're questioned about the previous M-band upgrade and ratings, and Maggie especially is questioned about her relationship with Gus, where she has to dodge questions about both him and her father through a lie detector. Garrett Mercer shows up for this event for goodness knows what reason, and greets Ivy and Quentin. They go through the whole process of breathing in the cleaning chemicals and reprogramming their M-bands and get ready to register the new ratings. Maggie delays turning her Ferrotech on, concerned about her and Quentin's true match rating being revealed, but when she's told to turn it on, she instead registers only negative relationships, and locks eyes with Quentin to realise that he knew this would happen. Oh, also, Ivy and Quentin's actual rating is 73%. Fun fact. They're just about to register these ratings when a fire alarm goes off, and the lights go out. Maggie, who's just been kept in darkness for 4 weeks, starts panicking as guards enter, but they only go to protect Garrett. Then smoke starts to fill the room and everyone is told to evacuate. But of course, Maggie is panicking.
A hand grabs her and she realizes it's Quentin wearing a glow-in-the-dark ring. He hands her off to Gus, who's shown up also wearing a glow-in-the-dark ring, and who leads her away. It turns out that he rigged this whole thing. Maggie and Gus escape and make it to Burn, the club her brother used to work at. Gus tells her that the manager owes him a debt and has given them access to her apartment upstairs. This also gives us a nice chance to see how depressed Gus is over how poorly Maggie's been treated, and how it's destroyed her mentally, especially with her new need to hoard food. He tells her that Quentin was basically just released after the end of the last book, but that to be trusted by his father he had to pretend to completely hate her, and used a few nasty tricks he'd picked up from her to ensure her release, through convincing his father that it was in the name of punishing her. It also turns out that the guards who were with him at school weren't there to protect him from her, or from anyone else, but instead, as Gus says, they were a glorified prison. Also, there's a plot hole here. Gus says sarcastically, "Thanks for letting me in on that one," in reference to Quentin and Maggie being a true match, implying that he didn't know that they were. But all signs in the previous book, including the fact that he was there and holding Quentin's M-band when it first registered a 100% rating with Maggie's at the start of the book, points to the fact that he did know. So what's up with that, Shervington? Anyway, Gus and Maggie have a heart-to-heart about how Quentin probably still has resentment for her, but at the very least didn't want her to be stuck underground forever, and how he and Gus orchestrated the whole plan to have her released and the M-bands retested, and rigged smoke bombs and other things so they could get her out. After they've had some food in this chat, Maggie asks about when she gets to see Quentin, making this probably the longest period of time in which Quentin isn't mentioned in this book. Maybe. It was a few paragraphs. Quentin is being watched constantly, and Gus has very limited contact with him via Morris, so they have no clue how long it will take for him to get enough time away to visit her. Later, Maggie and Gus have another heart-to-heart about how they actually kind of care about each other, and have a mini party for purposes of Gus being quirky, I guess. This is followed by another heart-to-heart where they talk about how sucky life was for Maggie underground, and how neither of them had any clue that her father was so horrible. But we also get the revelation that 6 months ago, Gus had found the hidden files Maggie was using to blackmail him and had deleted them, meaning he's been pretending to hate her this whole time and was helping her of his own free will. This conversation is one of the many in the book that makes me feel like, after Quentin, Gus is the best and arguably most well-rounded character. We see his character growth spurred on by a strong sense of justice, and also his sympathy for Maggie, not wanting to see her fighting alone. Also, he's literally the single most useful character in this duology, because without Gus, literally nothing would happen. Gus is the plot. Literally every single roadblock the characters run into, whether it be caused by M-Corp, society as a whole, or even relationship struggles, is fixed by Gus. It's insane. Quentin doesn't show up for several days, and they find out that he's been watched too closely to come, which also allows for this hilarious interaction between Maggie and Gus when she bothers him in the middle of work about Morris's message. Quote, "Did Morris's message say anything else?" I asked between sit-ups. Gus was going through blueprints. I should have been too, but once again I'd slipped into daydream mode. "Yes, he said that Quentin really misses you and that you're the only thing in the world he thinks about." "Really?" I whispered. Gus rolled his eyes. "Of course not really. Christ, who are you and what have you done with Maggie? I'll kick your ass if you even think that kind of crap about me." Gus's dialogue makes an epic return. Maggie is just as disgusted as Gus that she's turned into a lovesick girl. Later that night, Maggie goes for a run to the Muay Thai center and gets ambushed by Master Ra, who thinks she's an intruder. He comments on how surprised he is that she's still alive, and how weak she is, and agrees to help her meet with Pre-Evo and to help train her back up to get strength. So, in this book, instead of having dreams about her dad, Maggie has started having nightmares about being underground, where she's in the dark and Garrett and her father mock her while turning Quentin against her. When she wakes up from the nightmare, Quentin is there and helps calm her down, and then the awkwardness begins. Because, what do you say to someone you've been so terrible to? Anyway, Maggie falls asleep in his arms and gets to panic when she wakes up again and he's not there. But Quentin interrupts her panic to tell her that he only has a few minutes left to stay here and he's made breakfast.
Housewife Quentin returns. In the kitchen, they have an awkward conversation about how little Maggie thought of him before she actually got to know him, and about how and why she didn't tell him the truth that they were a true match. This whole conversation is needlessly awkward and convoluted, but basically Quentin feels depressed about what happened and has some resentment towards Maggie, but still loves her at the end of the day and is very angry about how she was treated by their fathers. Maggie, on the other hand, feels very guilty and like she's a terrible person. I do think this line from Quentin sums it up nicely though. Quote, "Well, I guess we failed each other. You left me in my own personal hell while I stood back and watched them drag you into yours." Wow, Quentin back with the banger lines! I'm so in love with this guy's emotional intelligence. Anyway, they get into a strained, semi-accusatory, semi-romantic situation where they're both pained and kind of yelling at each other, which Gus interrupts, expressing his hatred of the fact that Maggie doesn't actually hate everyone anymore. Maggie then lets Gus and Quentin in on her plan to meet with Pre-Evo and give them all of the intel she has in exchange for them getting her into an entire hub of negs to break them all out. They, of course, aren't keen on this, and Quentin also wants to figure out more about what's going on behind the scenes with his family before Maggie gets herself killed, if nothing else. He mentions that his father and brother Zachary are far gone, and he reckons his mum is too, but he's not sure if his older brother Sebastian has completely fallen, and would, really like to know whether he is, since, well, if he isn't, it would be nice for him to have at least one family member who isn't evil. Maggie goes to meet with Pre-Evo, a meeting which, oddly enough, takes place in the middle of a cemetery? Fun. She meets the contact Alex, who turns out to be the brother of Gus's disappeared girlfriend Kelsey, and he gives her 5 minutes to talk. Alex tells her she's a liability for being caught with Quentin, and tells her she's just better off running away with her family, and that she's blown her chance of working with them. Pre-Evo have survived by being a non-threat to the government and to M-Corp, and that's how they want to stay. At this point, a helicopter and M-Corp cars show up, coming for Maggie. Alex skedaddles, leaving her alone, and she has to fight off a bunch of guards who turn out to be negs. Lovely. She manages to get away and jump on a train before letting Gus know Pre-Evo don't want to work with them. She also has to break the news to Gus that Kelsey doesn't want to see him anymore. Also, they probably have to change location since M-Corp could well know where they're staying and where Master Ra lives. The next time we see Maggie, she's in a laneway, waiting for a car which she follows into a garage, where she beats up Travis and makes him let her into his apartment. Once that's done, she shoots him in the balls with her tranquilizer. Lovely. Maggie and Gus start cleaning up the apartment and moving their stuff in, at which point Travis wakes up and Gus lets Maggie know that Quentin dropped in before he left. This sends Maggie into a spiral of panic, thinking that Quentin is going to dangerous places and they're going to be followed and so on and so on. And the lift door opens and she whips out her gun and points it at Quentin. Duh. Lovely. This then sends her into a rage about how she could have shot him, and yeah, Maggie isn't a very emotionally stable person. Quentin has something serious to tell her, so they move to a separate room where he tells her that he overheard his mother telling someone to keep an eye on Quentin and prepare to take him out of the game, while also telling them to leave Sebastian and Zachary alone as she's convinced they're loyal. This is, of course, pretty devastating to him, but he's happy that Maggie's on his side if nothing else. But then he starts acting all weird and basically goes all lovey-dovey. Maggie finds out that he's taken a lust enhancer, which is basically what it sounds like, but she comments that, considering they make people feel higher attraction to others than their actual rating, anyone who takes one around their true match would be pretty much unable to control themselves, hence why he's acting so weird. Maggie, in a moment of responsibility, separates herself from him. Thank goodness this YA book doesn't condone drugged sex like most of them seem to do. Outside the bedroom, she awkwardly admits to Gus that it probably took her longer than it should have to realise that Quentin was drugged off his mind. She also tells Gus off because it turns out that Gus tranked Travis again. A while later, Quentin emerges more sober. Maggie makes some ramen and Quentin patches up her injuries from fighting M-Corp earlier. They're about to kiss and then Travis wakes up. Maggie ungags Travis only for him to complain about being shot in the balls, and to rage at Quentin about how he should go back to his family because Maggie's going to get him killed. Maggie confronts him about double-crossing her to her father, and he tells her that he didn't know who her father was, or that he was her father until he'd already taken his money and couldn't back out, but that he had tried to warn her by telling her to not go through with the plan. He keeps wincing while he's talking, presumably because he got shot in the balls, so Quentin grabs a packet of frozen veggies to put in his lap, showing yet again what a good person Quentin is. Maggie blackmails Travis into getting his whole team to work for them, and they introduce him to the plan. He, Maggie, and 4 of his men will go into the tunnels and release an entire neg hub, but of course Quentin demands to come too. Unfortunately, Maggie doesn't really have a plan after that, which is awkward for everyone involved, but Quentin points out that the release of the hub will create a divide in public opinion, which will also divide the power structures of their society. In exchange for helping them, Travis will be free once everything is done. At this point, Quentin goes to call Morris and tells her about how Morris is hosting a charity event tonight, and Quentin will have to go back to grab all of his stuff, including a large amount of money, since, well, Quentin's made a lot of money helping Morris run his gambling rings. So Maggie and Quentin get ready to go and leave an unhappy Gus to keep an eye on Travis. In the taxi there, Quentin reveals to Maggie that this event is a super glammed up, rich charity ball run for all of the social elites, which actually has an interesting mechanic behind it. On entry, everyone is given a mask. Some masks have jewels and some are just glass. Everyone keeps their Ferrotech on and has a fun masked ball night, theoretically free of class and family connections. At the end of the night, everyone chooses to donate their mask to one of several charities, without knowing whether the mask is basically worthless or priceless. They also have a confrontation in which Maggie inadvertently reveals that she was pretty convinced Quentin would betray her, and he feels upset but unsurprised about this. He also points out how his family is literally committing genocide while justifying why he wouldn't return to them. They basically decide to trust each other anyway, and at that point have made it to the ball, where they pull up into a laneway and run into none other than Ivy! The Queen herself is here to help them. She's picked up a gown for Maggie and has been publicly seen in it that night, so with a wig and a mask, Maggie should be able to disguise herself as Ivy. Quentin reveals that from the moment he returned to school, Ivy knew something was up and was ready to help him as a friend. Maggie's not convinced, so Ivy, in true Quentin's friend fashion, delivers this banger. Quote, "He's telling you the truth, and if you want to make this ruse happen tonight, you're going to have to get over your issues and hurry the hell up." Thankfully for everyone involved, Maggie may hate girls and be jealous of Ivy, but she's smart enough to recognize that Ivy has a point, so she follows her inside and is led to an office where she spends a lot of time dilly-dallying and feeling self-conscious, while Ivy instructs her to strip and change into her gown, put on a wig, and so on. While Maggie wallows in self-pity and inwardly complains about her supposedly ugly self, Ivy tells her how she basically just said yes to helping Quentin when he asked, since they'd been friends forever and were kind of thrown together. Although she'd been hoping for a good rating, when they didn't get one in the first book, she wasn't actually that disappointed, and says that she loves him, but as a friend. She knows she's in danger, but wants to help them anyway, and can see that Quentin truly loves Maggie, in a way Ivy's never seen from him before. She also offers to be friends with Maggie too, which reminds us, the reader, of how they got a very solid friendship rating in the first book. And Maggie asks her for help with her hair as a kind of peace offering. When everything's done, Ivy says that Maggie looks passably like her, including that her hair is as good as a wig can be, and that they're about the same height and weight, at which point Maggie makes a comment about just needing to be starved for that to happen, which of course horrifies Ivy, who encourages her not to repress her feelings. She also tells Maggie that Quentin is one of the good ones who will take care of her and be there for her, and that Maggie just needs to uncomplicate their relationship. Ivy, can you marry me, please? Seriously, I love Ivy, and I think this scene was a really good one for showing us that Maggie isn't actually in the right to hate all women, but instead that the women she's been hating from the start are real people with real feelings and relationships, who aren't just shallow and money hungry.
And yeah, Ivy may not be into sports and punching people, and she may be a beauty guru, but that doesn't make her unintelligent, shallow, or mean. Actually, instead of wanting to do something girly like go to the ball, Ivy's looking forward to spending some time at home watching a movie. In fact, I'm not surprised that people pushed Ivy and Quentin towards each other, because they really deserve each other. They're both too nice, especially for spoiled rich kids. You know what, let's throw Morris in there too. Anyway, Maggie leaves Ivy alone and goes to the mask selection room where a woman named Eva picks a mask for her. Just as she's about to put it on her face, Eliza Mercer walks in and makes a comment about how nice it looks and how memorable her flair for fashion is, making it obvious that even though she addresses Maggie as Ivy, she knows who she is. Eliza also asks Maggie to tell Quentin to dance with her that night since she hasn't seen him much lately, probably because of Maggie. And with that awkward conversation out of the way, Maggie flees. In the ballroom, she finds Quentin and moves towards him before being stopped by a man in a red tuxedo, who criticizes her for not having her ferrotech on. She turns hers on and they have a 17% compatibility, so basically not even friends. Another man approaches and criticizes the first man, Justin, for forcing himself on people, and turns to Maggie, asking her to dance. The man points out that she's distracted, which is true since she's thinking about getting to Quentin and Morris, and he directs her to their rating, which she hasn't looked at once, and which is a very solid 79%, a long-term relationship rating. Unfortunately, as the man says, it's his highest rating yet, but he knows Maggie is spoken for, at which point the man reveals that he is, in fact, Morris. Morris and Maggie have to be very sneaky, since Morris's M-band has been hacked and people are listening to their conversation. Thus, they have an awkwardly veiled conversation and Morris passes her an envelope, which supposedly has everything he could do for them and gives her directions to a car that they can use. Maggie thanks him and he leaves, while Maggie grabs Quentin and drags him behind her to the exit. They enter a staff-only area and convince a woman to let them be alone, with the implication that they want to make out privately. Maggie tells Quentin about what's happened and that his mum knows they're there, and passes on the message from Morris. At this point, he inexplicably starts rambling about how much he loves her and how she drives him crazy, and how he felt so bad when he couldn't run up to her when she came back to school, and how he feels like a terrible person for hurting her emotionally and for even kind of wanting to do it as payback, and so on and so on. Which, like, I don't know, buddy, like, even at your worst, I think Maggie's done far worse than you. But also, this scene exemplifies something really annoying about this book. Neither Maggie nor Quentin thinks the other one still loves them for various reasons, but they both keep showing and professing their love for one another, so how do they both think the other person still hates them? Like, I know they're hormonal barely 18s, but neither of them are stupid. Far from it. Can't they just, like, listen to what the other person is saying? Anyway, the two split up to leave, and Maggie hands her mask in to the International Aid Charity Bowl before leaving. She and Quentin meet at the car, where Maggie searches the back of the car and the glove compartment, following Morris's instructions. In the glove compartment, they find a hidden note with a map and a number plate. They drive to a museum where they knock out 2 guards and run to find the other car, which they open to find a note from Morris, which expresses his appreciation that Maggie isn't dead. He then tells them that the previous car was bugged, but the current car isn't. He also included Quentin's money zips, but there are 2 extra, which Quentin's father gave him to set Quentin up. Morris says he, quote, marked them up like we used to show Quentin which ones were bad. He also reckons the other zips have been tampered with, but doesn't know what the issue is, and encourages them to scan them before using. It turns out that the marking Morris has put on the zips is a small glow-in-the-dark dot on each of the good ones. There's also a game zip Quentin can play to unlock the file with all of his information. Maggie runs the 2 booby-trapped zips to the station where she puts them on trains going in different directions, and then she calls Gus. The 2 decide they need access to Gus's old computer at their old workplace, so they agree to meet there in 20 minutes, despite the time of night. At the store, Maggie instructs Quentin to stay in the car while she goes in. She runs into the night guard Darren, who she's been giving coffees for years, just for this occasion, and convinces him to let her in, saying she's left a few things behind because she has a relationship with Gus and now he's in trouble. She meets up with Gus around the back and they check for zips. Some need further cleaning, but most are okay. They're just about to leave when someone comes looking for them with their flashlight, and of course, can you see where this is going? Maggie assumes it's Darren and grabs Gus to kiss him, but of course it's Quentin, who is obviously not impressed. When they get back to Travis's apartment, Travis and Gus run off to have a drink and Quentin beelines for the bathroom, so Maggie gets some time to herself to feel guilty and regret her choices. She calls through the door that the kiss didn't mean anything, and so on, until she hears something crash loudly, which of course sends her into a panic, especially because not only is Quentin not answering her, he's now not making any noise at all. Maggie grabs a knife to pick the lock with and finds Quentin shirtless for some reason, with his hands all bloody from the mirror he smashed. He obviously doesn't want to be around her, but he does agree to let her clean his hands up. So that's good, I guess. While Maggie's working on that, Quentin tells her that Gus is clearly in love with her, which she, can kind of see. He also reveals that he'd thought she was telling the truth about them not having previously been in a relationship, but implies that, well, he doesn't really believe her now. Thus, they have a conversation in which Quentin is kind of convinced Maggie's going to leave him for Gus, and Maggie keeps saying she doesn't even want to match with Gus because of how uninterested she is, and they argue to the point that Maggie starts borderline yelling at him about how much she loves him and how she's sorry that she destroyed his life, and so on. He also admits that he was a bit scared of himself when he realised that he had to break the mirror to stop himself from pretty much murdering Gus, which is I appreciate the self-control, Quentin, but that's a bit concerning. Thankfully, at the end of this conversation, Maggie manages to pretty much convince him that she doesn't like Gus. Small wins, I guess. Maggie is sitting in bed, still awake, when Gus and Travis come back, and Gus encourages Quentin to beat him up and get it over and done with, which Quentin refuses to do. The two demand to see her, at which point Maggie pretends to be sleeping, and Quentin gets offended that Gus and Travis would even think he would ever hurt her. Gus rants about how much Maggie's been having nightmares and losing sleep and everything, and then passes out. In the morning, Maggie finds Quentin asleep on the sofa and Travis having a coffee. His men will be there at 2 p.m, and he assures Maggie he hasn't talked to her father for a long time, and that he never even collected the money for selling her out, since he felt so bad. Maggie goes for a run, does some Muay Thai with Master Ra, and tells him a bit about the plan, while he gives her a letter from her brother Sam, which she reads back in her room. The letter basically just says that they're safe and have been keeping on the move, but that her mum is struggling knowing she's in danger, and that they miss her. Travis grabs her from her room to watch the inevitable confrontation between Quentin and Gus, in which Gus claims not to remember most of last night and thanks Quentin for not beating him up, right before Quentin punches him. Before Travis and Maggie can intervene, Quentin assures them he's done with just the one punch, and just wanted to make sure Gus was fully sober before sending him a very obvious message. Then he leaves, allowing Maggie and Gus to have an awkward conversation about how Gus actually did develop a crush on her, but actually the kiss wasn't as good as he thought it would be. And while they're talking about relationships, they also wonder why Kelsey suddenly started ghosting him. At 2 p.m, Travis's men show up. They're called Ned, Hex, and Liam. The crew run over the plan, everyone gets prepped, and the 7 of them head off to hopefully set a neg hub free. Place your bets now on whether they're successful or not. Oh, also, Maggie gives Travis strict instructions to stay by Quentin's side the whole time, and the two come to a silent agreement that if Quentin dies, Travis dies too, at Maggie's hands. Maggie and Liam go down to the metro, where Maggie throws a bag in a bin and they stand at the end of the platform. Once Gus has turned the cameras off, the bag goes off with small explosions, and Liam and Maggie can sneak onto the tracks and go into a hidden tunnel. Inside the tunnel, Maggie threatens Liam with her tranq gun and tells him to reveal what he's hiding. Liam insists that he isn't hiding anything and shows her that he's a neg, old enough of a neg that they didn't have tattoos yet, and branded him instead at his collarbone. He tells her about how he had a wife and son, and that he and his wife had initially rated strong, but on the way home from turning down a sketchy job, the M-Corp guards picked him up and he rated negatively. He escaped from the processing camp before he could be taken underground, and had been working for Travis in the black market ever since. He tells Maggie that he had initially gone home to his wife and child, but that they'd fed her lies about him being evil and she'd killed herself.
Liam's goal is to make enough money for both him and his son to go off-grid. Maggie apologizes for suspecting him, and the two awkwardly continue their journey to the door of a garage, where they let the others in. The group then run through several junctions before getting to their target hub and set up their plan. They'll drop down in groups to take out the guards and disable security. Maggie, of course, has the hope that she won't need to kill anyone, since so far she hasn't gone that far. Maggie and Liam work together to take out several of the guards, at which point Liam points out the tubes running from tanks into the main building of the hub. He worked in chemical weapons in the military, so he knows this isn't a good sign. Maggie runs, trying to get to Quentin and Travis, who are inside. They get out with a swipe card Travis stole, but have no clue what she's talking about. They trust her anyway, and everyone starts running as guards show up and start shooting at them. And Maggie can see that Quentin was shot in the arm, but Travis is well and truly dead. Maggie literally uses the phrase riddled with bullets. He body blocked all of the bullets meant for Quentin and died in the process. We'll talk about this later, but for now, just know that he served his purpose of keeping Quentin alive. Oh, speaking of, Hex was a traitor and working for MCorp all along. The guards at this point actually leave them alone, but the negs are being let out, and so is the gas, killing all of the negs. The holograms on the ceiling show various faces, including Kelsey's. Maggie's dad's voice comes over the loudspeaker, and he tells her that these are the consequences of her actions, and orders her and the others to stay where they are while they're apprehended. This makes Maggie lose all hope, and she thinks that all she can do is separate herself from Quentin and Liam. But at that point, more smoke bombs go off, and Quentin and Liam collapse. Maggie looks up and sees Alex from Pre-Evo, who calls her a stupid bitch before he knocks her out. When Maggie wakes up, her head is understandably in a lot of pain. She overhears some of the Pre-Evo people talking about what a nasty piece of work her dad is, and how they knew that Maggie and co would be walking into a trap. Maggie asks Alex if he knew that Kelsey would be there, and he didn't. He also reveals that Pre-Evo knew where Maggie and co were the whole time, including that they were staying at Burn. Then they were keeping an eye on her, but had lost her after her first meeting with Alex, until intel, provided to them by Liam, told them where Maggie was going, at which point they scrambled to follow and only just got them out. By the time they'd figured out that Hex was the traitor, it was too late. Liam apologizes to Maggie, who feels betrayed and knew there was something up with him. He and Alex explain that they just couldn't believe that both Quentin and Maggie were legit. But Liam and Alex both knew that they were going into a trap, and that MCorp would try and kill everyone. This knowledge sends Maggie into a rage that they just let everyone die, and Alex responds with similar anger that yeah, his sister is dead, but that wasn't his call to make. This is confusing for Maggie, since Alex is the head of Pre-Evo, right? But Alex tells her that he's just the front and someone else runs it. Someone else not for her to know. He orders for her to be taken away, and a woman called Grace in her mid-20s, or as Maggie calls her, a girl, in surprise at a female soldier, shows up. Grace takes Maggie down to the back and explains that Alex is just lashing out because his sister has died. She also explains that Maggie isn't a prisoner per se, but you know, they're keeping an eye on her. Quentin is getting treatment for his gunshot wound, and Gus is coming in on separate transport. Both Travis and Ned are dead, and neither body was retrieved. This gives Maggie a tiny second, like literally one sentence, to reflect on the fact that Travis sacrificed himself for Quentin and now his body will be underground forever. And then she just moves on. Wow. Anyway, Maggie also makes a comment that Grace, who just wants the world to be a better place, is a quote do-gooder, which apparently doesn't inspire any hope in Maggie. They get to a rundown theatre, which they enter, and which turns out to have been fully converted into a series of workstations, perfect for Pre-Evo, who turn out to have made an entire complex in it, including weapons storage and staff housing. At this point, they run into Gus and his guards, and Gus is beating himself up over the fact that he pressed the button to release all of the negs, which let the gas into their cells and killed all of them, including Kelsey. Maggie firmly tells him that it was on her orders, so it's not on him. He also tells her that he had no clue about the Pre-Evo base. Kelsey never told him. Grace goes to take Maggie to her room, but Maggie threatens her with, physical violence, what else, and demands she take her to Quentin. She instead takes her to a waiting room where she's left for a very long time before someone comes in. Eliza Mercer. This, I suppose naturally, leads Maggie to the conclusion that M Corp run literally everything and are even pre-Evo too. Like I've said, this is a natural conclusion to come to since over the course of 1.5 books so far, we've seen how M Corp control more things than even Maggie thought they did. Eliza tells her it's not M Corp playing both sides, but just Eliza. But of course, Maggie doesn't believe this. Eliza tells her that she was recruited by the CIA from 18 onwards, and that she was similar to Maggie when she was younger. She travelled and worked undercover before meeting Garrett, who she fell in love with and quit for. She never told him or her family the truth about her past, and eventually it became a form of self-preservation when M Corp got big. The government knew that M Corp were getting too powerful, so they set up a sleeper group with Eliza, an inside agent, to take down M Corp if they ever took human life into their own hands. Basically, Eliza is the true head of pre-Evo and Alex is just the face, and Eliza's been trying to help Quentin and Maggie the whole time, but they kept losing her. Maggie asks about her thoughts on the rest of the family, and she says that while she still loves Garrett, he was lost to greed long ago, and she loves her country more, which is very American. Zachary is also long gone, and although she's not certain, she thinks Sebastian is pretty far gone too. She says she was also worried about Quentin, but she's seen Maggie with him, and she'd done digging into her and knew that Quentin would do the right thing. She also admits that, although she tried to stall, she did indeed tell Garrett who Maggie was, basically betraying her. But she didn't know about the time that Quentin and Maggie went into the tunnels and got captured, hence she couldn't help them. Maggie's still not entirely convinced, so Eliza opens the door to reveal Master Ra, which Maggie is shocked about for some reason. Like, why? I understand being shocked and upset about Eliza running pre-Evo, but like, Master Ra was literally a contact of Alex's and was trying to encourage Maggie to join pre-Evo, so like, of course he was involved with them. But Maggie starts crying and says she feels betrayed. Anyway, it turns out that Master Ra trained Eliza too. Eliza tells Maggie she wants her to go to Quentin, but wants her to lie to him, keeping the fact that Eliza is the leader of pre-Evo from him. Maggie reluctantly agrees to this and goes to Quentin, who looks decent considering he was shot. She expresses her regret that she killed so many people, but he encourages her to keep fighting and find another way. Also, do you remember right at the start of the first book when Maggie described Quentin visually and said he had a small scar near his hairline that he refused to cover and it was the only thing she liked about him? Yeah, well, me neither, but in this scene we find out the Scar backstory. He was rock climbing when he was 14 and Sebastian was messing around when he slipped, so Quentin caught him, but his head hit the rock. They somehow got to safety, and Eliza told Quentin that wounds received during acts of honor could be worn like a badge, which is why he didn't hide it. At this point, Maggie tells him that his mum is in charge, citing her promise to him to never lie to him again. Maggie gets dragged away to a room where Alex tells her she's a piece of work, which is true, and rages at her about how she killed his sister. Maggie rages back at him about how pre-Evo have tons of firepower and manpower, but they just sit around doing nothing. But in the middle of this argument, the lights go off, and a voice, Quentin's voice, comes over the intercom saying that pre-Evo had better bring Maggie back to him or he and Gus will set off tech bombs, basically EMPs, all day long. Alex reluctantly takes her to the control room, maybe? Quentin, Gus, and a bunch of armed guards are there, and they all look pretty relaxed. Quentin storms over to Maggie and kisses her. Guys, I know that literal gas chambers have been used, so you might have forgotten, but this is a YA romance after all. At this point, Eliza shows up, and Quentin demands that she never again separates him from his family being Maggie and Gus. Oh, that made me cringe a bit, sorry Quentin. After that, everyone heads back to business, and Eliza, Maggie, Gus, Quentin, Alex, Grace, and 2 other dudes sit down to have a meeting. Maggie tells them about her father's experiments, and Eliza reveals to Quentin that she knew what was happening to him in the first book the whole time. They discuss the implications of an entire country being made permanently negative, and the anarchy that would follow, and how M Corp planned to use crop dusting to turn entire countries negative, mostly developing countries in Africa. Literal ethnic cleansing. Their solution? An antidote. I'm going to speed through the next chapter. Maggie's having nightmares and wakes up in the middle of the night. She heads to Quentin's room, finding that he's already come to get her, and they passionately make out in the hallway before heading to the bedroom, and the cameras fade to black. Thank goodness for the camera fading to black. In the morning, they have a conversation about whether they're scared, especially considering the results from last night's meeting, such as how Eliza will take down Garrett and that they'll have to do their best to subdue Sebastian and Zachary. At this point, Maggie comments that they should probably get dressed, and Quentin agrees, and then Eliza agrees, having entered without them noticing. She also reveals that the rooms don't have cameras, but the hallways do. Ha! I did really enjoy the fun moments like this during the book. Are they Marvel movie type humour? I mean, sure, but I also just think they're genuinely funny, especially if you're not taking the book too seriously, and I wasn't taking it seriously when I reread these books. When she leaves, Quentin and Maggie have a brief conversation about the possibility of telling everyone about their true match rating, which they decide not to do, and Maggie expresses her desire for them to go back to school, finish their exams, and then move out to the country with Sam and her mum and have a small farm. And also go to uni if they want to. I reckon the end of this book is more drawn out than it needs to be, so let's speedrun it, kind of, as much as I can. Pre-Evo plus Maggie's trio finish planning everything with, of course, lots of fun jokes, lots of people being annoyed with how lovey-dovey Quentin and Maggie are, and lots of Quentin being annoyed with Eliza for not being a better mother. Gus will shut down all of the hubs once they get to the main control room, and they'll then release all of the negs, while revealing the deception of M-Corp to the public. They also decide to change the ratings text so it doesn't show any specific ratings less than 15% and more than 85%, aka no one has a numeric justification, either high or low, to kill anyone anymore. They also have labs in Canada set up so they can process an antidote within 18 hours if they succeed. Maggie and Master Ra have a heartfelt conversation. Gus gloats over his cool tactical outfit since he needs to come down to the tunnels with them, and Maggie, Quentin, Gus and Liam are off to the central hub. While they go to find information about the antidote and get into the system, other pre-Evo units will take over key buildings and capture key M-Corp members. As part of this chaos, Liam kills several M-Corp guards and Eliza's transit pod is ambushed and she's taken to Garrett. Maggie sends Liam and Quentin off to go help Eliza, and takes some of Quentin's blood to use as a DNA signature to help get into the main lab. Gus and Maggie continue alone, with lots of fun banter to keep them going. Through hacked radio frequencies, they suspect Maggie's father is inside, so she goes in first, locking Gus temporarily in a decontamination chamber so her father thinks she came alone, and she enters, only to have a gun shoved to the back of her head. Duh. Maggie's dad villain monologues while he threatens to kill Sam and her mum, who he has captured ready to be gassed and beaten up. Maggie shocks her dad with the knowledge that Eliza Mercer is the leader of Pre-Evo enough to tussle with him, and shoves some of the disruption down his throat, but of course he has an antidote, which he takes, nicely giving Maggie all of the information she needs about it. Very convenient. He shoots Maggie in the shoulder and leaves her to die in front of her family while asking Sebastian over the radio about Quentin, to which Sebastian, through a lie detector, responds that he killed his brother. This sets Maggie off and she rages at her father about how she idolized him and he let her down, and he reveals to her that he's been double-crossing M-Corp and plans to sell the antidote to the disruption to make oodles of money. Damn, this ending is convoluted. Anyway, Maggie's father is a fan of villain monologuing, as you may have noticed, which he does at the end of both Disruption and Corruption, so he keeps chit-chatting about how he's a god and that he's so smart to have figured out that the antidote is made from the DNA of a true match, and so on and so on. He also gives us the interesting statistic that 70% or more of the negs probably aren't actually negs. Just as Maggie is about to be shot, Gus lets himself out of the chamber and takes the shot for her, and shoots her father, although not enough to kill him. Maggie shoots him several times with the goal of Gus not needing to kill anyone, and then, I kid you not, Gus just dies. Dang, like, I know the point of this scene is to make us feel depressed that the comedic relief died, but Gus was one of the better and more interesting characters in this series, so it really is depressing that he dies, although probably not for the reasons Shervington intended. Maggie leaves Sam and her mum after they're freed, of course, to go after Quentin. She finds Eliza and Garrett talking. Although Eliza is pointing a gun at him, neither of them really think she can kill him after all of the time they've spent together. Eliza has faith in their relationship and lowers her gun as a peace offering, but of course, Garrett, being the man he is, takes the opportunity to shoot her instead. Lovely. As she dies, Maggie has the chance to reflect on the fact that Eliza really and truly thought that their love would be enough, and that Eliza had the answer she needed in death. You know, the fact that it wasn't enough. At this point, Sebastian arrives, horrified that his father killed his mother. Maggie jumps out of hiding and kills Garrett, then points the gun at Sebastian and rages at him about how he killed Quentin. But he tells her that yes, he did tell the truth that he killed his brother, but he killed Zachary, not Quentin. Quentin shows up at this point too and tells Maggie about how Sebastian has been undercover with a group from the UN the whole time and wasn't actually part of MCorp's plots. While Quentin and Sebastian try to help Eliza, Maggie collapses from blood loss. She has a nightmare similar to the ones from the start of the book where her father gloats about everyone who's died because of her, and how she has now given up and is dying. She semi-hallucinates Quentin pulling her out of the dream and wakes up to him basically having a freak out because he thought she died. The next section of the book is him telling her the antidote was created successfully, her meeting Sam and her mum, and them handing off Gus's final zip USB thing for Quentin to use, since he and Sebastian are the owners of MCorp now. Oh, also, it turns out that they did a blood transfusion with Quentin's blood for her, since most true matches are apparently also blood type matches, and as Quentin says, that's handy when you're AB negative. The next chapter starts with a banger of a line, quote, "That was the last time I saw Quentin Mercer." I was like, what the hell, Shervington? I swear, when I read this for the first time, 11-year-old me had a heart attack. But, trust me, although this sentence is false, the message it's trying to send makes sense. Basically, Maggie spends a lot of time in hospital and then wakes up on a helicopter, and then in a bed in a massive house in the countryside. Her mum and Sam tell her about how Quentin basically bought Maggie an entire ranch with tons of livestock, a massive house and grounds, and even an entire set of staff. Quentin and Sebastian were taken into custody but have been cooperating with the UN and world governments, and no one has arrested Maggie yet for killing her father and Garrett Mercer. However, it does turn out that there's been a development. Gus's final move was to record basically an entire documentary about Maggie's life and his involvement with her. He reveals his crimes and introduces Maggie as a girl who lost her dad and whose world fell apart, and the woman she became, basically the same lines from the beginning of the book. He shows all of Maggie's evidence of the terrible reality of neg camps, and he tells everyone about her horrible plan to manipulate Quentin, and yeah, this does mean that he does indeed show all of the terrible things she did, but he also shows all of the good things she did, like fighting against her father, and even her being shot in the first book and being stapled together by Gus, which is odd. How in the world did Gus have the foresight and emotional stability, and also the resources, to film that and to know it would be important footage to show Maggie's determination and make people empathize with her? Like, what? Was he planning this documentary from the start? Anyway, this is basically a pro-Maggie propaganda documentary, and when it ends, a government message shows up saying that people are being treated with the antidote and everything is under control after these horrible revelations. It also shows people being showered with the antidote. Gus will have a funeral which Maggie gets to go to, and Sam and her mum also show her around the property to show her why the, quote, extra security they've been talking about that Quentin hired for her is needed. They find a mass of people at the edge of the property, which sends Maggie into a panic, thinking that they're there to punish her for her crimes. But of course, in true Maggie fashion, she's too self-hating, and they turn out to be there holding a literal vigil for her. They even, I kid you not, sing Amazing Grace for her. I'll get back to this later, but WTF? And despite all of this, and despite Gus's doco exposing literally everything, Maggie says that they wouldn't be singing if they knew about all of the things she'd done. Like, girl, they do know about all of the things you've done. I mean, I wouldn't sing for you, but clearly they would. She spends the next few days catching up to date on the news. How everyone loves Gus, how the world has been finding out about the horrors of M-Corp, and so on. She also sees a news broadcast where Quentin makes a speech, but most of all she's just focusing on how handsome he is and how powerful he looks and how he looks unhurt, although tired. Basically, the country will be voting on whether to implement the 15% to 85% restriction on Ferrotech. Why the country wants to continue using the tech after M-Corp was exposed, I'll never know, but I'll discuss that more later too. Anyway, in the last chapter, Quentin shows up at the ranch after the vote passed, and he's super handsome, and Maggie's super happy to see him, and he's super happy to see her, and all of that. He forgives her for killing his father, and they plan to stay on the ranch together once everything's blown over. Actually, at this point, they attend Gus's funeral, which has become a whole event, and at the end, reporters swamp them, asking Quentin if he still loves Maggie after everything she's done. And in my opinion, fitting end to this duology, Quentin responds, quote, 100%. And thus, the book ends. Wow, what a ride. Okay, let's talk about it. As with Disruption, I'll start with my personal book journal review of Corruption after I reread it a few months ago. I think the choice to make this series a duology, not a trilogy or a series, was really good, since the plot could be more focused / condensed. The book has many of the same strengths and issues as the previous one. Fun, but also contrived with occasionally unusual and immature prose and dialogue, and may have suffered from being published only about 6 months after the first one. Maggie is still not like other girls and still doesn't like other girls, and she is the saviour of the world, but at least the second thing there becomes a bit better as she realises what a queen Ivy is. I wish we saw more of Ivy and Morris. My biggest issue is that many of the events in this book seem plot-driven, not character-driven, especially with characters like Travis who seemed too nice and self-sacrificing for no reason. I feel like the issues of society also resolved too quickly after the final battle, although the hints that rehabilitation and healing could take longer were nice, but I wish they were more emphasised. Overall, I thought it was a satisfying ending to the series, and Quentin continues to be the best. Gus shouldn't have had to die though. I also wonder how much more thematically interesting the duology would have been if Quentin and Maggie actually had a negative rating and were still in love despite what the technology said. Epic review? Thank you, Casper. As past me mentioned in that review, Corruption has lots of the same problems Disruption does, and discusses similar themes with similarly varying levels of success. Actually, I think Corruption is a far weaker book than Disruption. The ending of the story leaves a lot of the themes with far more to be desired than Disruption does. And Corruption doesn't even have the psychological aspect of Maggie manipulating Quentin, which I found horrifically fascinating. Nor does it have the mystery of what happened to her father. I talked about most of these themes, including their endings, in more depth during my discussion of Disruption, so I won't go too far into it here, but let's discuss. So first, themes in Disruption that were continued in Corruption. We have the surveillance society theme, which I think was one of the few well explored in Corruption. Corruption and the end of Disruption showed us how deep the M-Corp conspiracy is, and how many things they control. It also goes into more detail about how hard it can be to get around them. For instance, Maggie gets a black market M-band which can't be controlled by M-Corp, but if she walks past a hidden M-band scanner, she'll be discovered, so she just has to take the risk. Corruption also shows how many hidden groups actually have a huge amount of power. For instance, Pre-Evo ends up being almost as powerful as M-Corp, and even the United States government and the UN have secret tentacles in this business, despite barely being mentioned. Interestingly enough, I really liked how the government, which seemed oddly demure and oddly willing to bow down to M Corp in the first book, was actually shown to be quite self-aware in this book, and had prepared for the possibility of M Corp gaining too much power, communicating with Eliza and pre-Evo. If only the real US government did stuff like this. Next, the idea of society being negatively affected by trendy obsessions, in this case the M-bands. I mentioned this in my previous discussion, but it baffles me how, after Shervington spent so long talking about how terrible M-bands are and how terrible they've been for our self-awareness as a society, and after pointing out all of the bad things they do, like allowing propaganda and surveillance, she decided to have society keep them at the end of the book? And even further, keep the Ferrotech running? Like, imagine being a random citizen in this world. You've been enjoying your M-band and your Ferrotech, and thankfully for you, you're not a neg. But then all of a sudden there's an investigation into M Corp, and it turns out that not only have people been incorrectly categorized as negs and put in concentration camps, tortured and murdered, but also M Corp is an evil company stealing your data, controlling the black market, and doing goodness knows what else. Would you seriously want to keep your M-band or even your Ferrotech on after hearing that? I'm shocked there wasn't global outrage. And I mean, there was global outrage, but it was only about how Garrett and M Corp were evil. It wasn't about people trying to distance themselves from the company and their products. It seems very odd and unrealistic that as soon as supposedly good people, aka Sebastian and Quentin, are put in charge of the company, everyone's happy to just trust M Corp. Do you see what I'm saying? It's weird. And one of my least favourite parts of the book and ending. Okay, next. The theme of whether the Ferrotech is even right to begin with. Like I said in my previous discussion, it felt really weird to portray M Corp as such a bad company, and then have all of the real ratings just be unquestionably correct. Like, I feel like it would have been more thematically interesting to have Maggie's point be proven that technology shouldn't choose our relationships for us. But Maggie and Quentin are a true match, and that brings them through literally everything. And negs are actually evil, so long as they're the real negs, not the fake ones. And society decides to keep the rating system, and so on. Like I said in the previous discussion, I think it just would have been far more interesting for Maggie and Quentin to have had a real negative relationship, and for them to fall in love regardless. Oh, speaking of the fact that real negs are actually terrible people, despite that, this book goes all out on the Holocaust allegory. I mean, there are literal gas chambers in this one, and the main characters watch the Jew stand-ins get gassed by the evil overlords. This feels, icky to say the least, especially considering, as I keep mentioning, the fact that this book also confirms that negs are actually bad people. Like, holy moly. There's even Maggie's evil father villain monologuing while he gasses people. And his monologue is so evil that it borders on comedic, which is even weirder considering Holocaust allegories should only ever be completely serious and well considered. I mean, I do think that Shervington was serious about showing that this kind of behaviour is bad, but I don't think this was well considered considering the other aspects of the book, and thus it seems like she just decided she needed to make Maggie's dad as evil as possible, and this was the most evil thing she could think of. On the bright side, I do think the book continues to give a pretty good, for a YA romance, discussion of the negatives of an abusive prison system, and how broken many of our prison systems are, or in this case, the notoriously bad US prison system. For instance, it continues to show us how, even if they are reformed or escape, negs have no hope after they've initially been taken in. The soldiers that chase Maggie after she meets up with Alex are all negs, borderline forced into the military as their only realistic form of rehabilitation. And Liam talks about how his wife was so poisoned by propaganda and so horrified by her husband's neg status that she killed herself. We'll get back to her later, but basically, yeah, this shows how horrific Neg's status is. We also continue to see explorations of the wealth disparity, through showing how much harder life is for the lower classes, how much more they have to fear Neg's status, and through showing the opulent lifestyle of those at the top through things like the masked ball. I feel like that ball could have been a good exploration of fake charity from the uber rich, but it wasn't really used for that. And of course, developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, continue to be used to add emotional weight to the story. Maggie's dad is sterilizing Africans because he believes that they make too many kids, and he's making them negative so they can't reproduce. I mean, on one hand, yes, eugenics are bad, thanks. I appreciate we can all agree with that. And I appreciate that we can all agree that treating entire countries of people like insects to be dusted with insecticide is bad, but on the other hand, this seems clumsy and odd. Also, can I just say that they always refer to Africa as like a single entity? I mean, thankfully, they do refer to it as a series of countries, not just one country, but it's close, you know. There's also the nature of propaganda, which, although not as well explored in this book as the previous one, is still present, and is one of the more fleshed out and well explored themes. This book continues to be plot-driven, not character-driven, as with the last one, and some of the character arcs are very weird to account for this. First of all, I don't really feel like Maggie went through much of a character arc. She was just whatever the plot needed her to be. Quentin went through an arc of just becoming a more well-rounded and determined person, I guess. Gus didn't have a character arc, unless you consider him crushing on Maggie and sacrificing himself at the end an arc, and I can't think of anyone else who went through an arc either, so Quentin is the best character confirmed, I guess, with Gus as a backup. I do have one major grievance with the book being plot-driven though, that being Travis. Travis, despite ostensibly being an underworld Baron type, decides he likes Maggie for arbitrary reasons and doesn't collect the money he would have gotten from her father for selling her out, for moral objection reasons, I guess. But he could have used that money regardless, and it seems weird for a hardened criminal like Travis, who is only self-preserving, to do this. It also seems weird for him to agree to help Maggie any more than necessary, and most of all, it is baffling to me that he decided to take that round of bullets for Quentin and get himself killed. Like, yeah, Maggie borderline threatened to kill him if Quentin died, but self-serving Travis decided to sacrifice himself for a dude who just happens to be the boyfriend of a teenager he kind of respects a little bit. Now, you could argue that this was just Travis's character development, and that his development was him going from being a terrible person who only cares about himself to someone who respects the larger goal and can be selfless. But not only was there no larger goal at this point, there was also no hint of Travis becoming a better person, so this sudden sacrifice is weird. Also, there are a few plot holes, or maybe inconsistencies would be a better word. Like, how could someone as careful as Travis have missed that Hex was an M-Corp agent? How could Pre-Evo, who are so powerful, have lost track of Maggie when she moved from Bern? I mean, they went to Travis's place, and Pre-Evo presumably are aware of Travis and either work with him or spy on him, considering they planted Liam among his people. And if Travis trusted Liam, who was a double agent for Pre-Evo, Pre-Evo must have placed him there a long time ago. But he only seems to be there so he can meet Maggie and she can be later horrified by his backstory and feel betrayed by him. Oh, also Liam tells her that he has a scar because before they started tattooing Negs, tattoos, they just branded them. But like, we saw Negs being branded in the first book, so clearly they do still brand them. This timeline's a bit weird. Now, the not like other girls thing continues in this book, but is thankfully somewhat alleviated. Most women are still shallow or damsels in distress. For instance, Maggie's mum is always crying and needing to be saved. Kelsey is a damsel who gets to die for Maggie, Gus, and Alex's supposed character development, and Liam's wife gets to die to give him a sad backstory. Sarah the neg from the first book who Maggie saw get shot continues to show up in Maggie's dreams to act as sad backstory for her. Other than Maggie and those mentioned above, the only real female player in this story is Eliza, who is given considerably more screen time in this one. Eliza is portrayed as intelligent, motherly, and playful. She playfully references Maggie's wedding dress disaster in the previous book. She teases Quentin and Maggie about the cameras, seeing them make out in the hallway, and she teases Maggie about her gobsmacked reaction to Eliza being the leader of Pre-Evo. Eliza is certainly portrayed as a very strong woman. She's smart, she's been undercover the whole time, and she's been running and growing Pre-Evo behind the scenes, and chatting to the government while keeping up her role as Garrett's loving wife. She's also been pulling strings here and there, like trying to delay Garrett's discovery of who Maggie was, and she's been watching everything from behind the scenes. Although these elements are supposed to make us like her and think of her as a cool and strong woman, I feel like they just make her come off as Machiavellian and callous instead. Like, she openly admits, without pretty much any guilt or shame, that she knew what Maggie was doing psychologically to Quentin in the first book, and instead of integrating Quentin into Pre-Evo directly, she just decided to let it happen? Obviously, Quentin isn't pleased to hear about this. Eliza also knew about all of the torture and struggles Maggie experienced, both in the first book and before and after it, and decided to do nothing about it. She's had all of this power, and she's had Pre-Evo ready to go with the goal of pulling the kill switch on Garrett if he ever gets too greedy. But like, he got too greedy years ago, and she has still been standing around. What's she waiting for? A random teenager to show up? That's weird. Oh, also, you know what defeats this powerful, intelligent, and manipulative woman who doesn't even let the murder of thousands or the torture of her sons get to her? Love. Yep, she's killed because, as strong as she is, and as much as she knows Garrett is a terrible person and unsavable, she can't bear to kill the man she loves. Insane and out of character. Outside of Eliza, we also have Grace, the pre-Evo soldier who is sassy but easily overwhelmed by Maggie's strength, and who is basically set dressing. Eva, the lady who hides Maggie's secret of being in disguise at the ball and who gives her her mask, and who is also set dressing. And Ivy. Ivy, how much I love you. Ivy is the singular reason the Not Like Other Girls through line is better handled in this book than the first one. Only marginally so, though. In the first book, Maggie, if not explicitly, implicitly hated all girls, especially the ones she viewed as shallow like Ivy. At the start of Corruption, she views Ivy in the same way, and since Quentin and Ivy are supposedly dating again, she's even more jealous and resentful of Ivy. But in this book, Ivy helps Quentin and Maggie when they have to go to the ball. As I mentioned in the recap of the actual story, Maggie doesn't initially want to let Ivy help them. She doesn't trust her and thinks poorly of her in general. She also thinks that Ivy's still in love with Quentin, of course, and she doesn't believe Ivy and Quentin when they tell her otherwise. It takes a lot of convincing for her to go, and Ivy pointing out that she's wasting time. Even after that, Maggie is still stewing about how much Ivy and Quentin get along. But Ivy and Maggie have a really interesting conversation while Ivy's getting Maggie dressed. Ivy talks about peer pressure to be in a relationship with Quentin, and how she was never in love with him but always just wanted to be his friend, and so on. And she shows wit and kindness, making funny remarks while also being horrified with how M-Corp treated Maggie. She even has a mini therapy session with Maggie, encouraging her to not keep her feelings bottled up and to share them with Quentin, endorsing their relationship. Thankfully, Maggie for her part keeps the snark down and provides a peace offering, asking Ivy for help with her hair and makeup since she knows borderline nothing about either. And unlike in the first book where she makes snarky internal comments about how she doesn't know anything about beauty because she's just so cool and likes lockpicking and gun magazines instead, In this book, her comments about not knowing anything about beauty are framed neutrally. It's just a factual skill deficit that Ivy can fill. And it turns out that Ivy actually isn't shallowly obsessed with parties and doesn't mind leaving the party early. Instead, she just wants to watch a movie at home. You know, a normal thing that Maggie probably also likes doing too. Although we sadly don't see Ivy for the rest of the book, except for her being mentioned as part of the crowd at Gus's funeral, Maggie does think about her in vaguely grateful terms a few times in conjunction with Morris. So yeah, although Maggie is still both implicitly and explicitly not like other girls, and a woman/girl hater in this book, and the book lacks good and powerful female characters, it is far less so, and less obvious than in the first one, and we do get the minor redemption arc of Maggie no longer hating Ivy and seeing Eliza's true self. That true self being portrayed positively even if it is actually negative. So, you know, I'll take that as an improvement. The last thing I wanted to discuss is one of the things I disliked the most about this book, outside of what was, in my opinion, an unrealistic societal ending. That was Maggie being idolized so much. The first book was a borderline cautionary tale about the dangers of idolizing people too much. Maggie idolized her father so much she went to the ends of the world for him and became a horrible and immoral person. But in the end he was evil anyway, so all of her effort and suffering, and all of the effort and suffering of others, was in vain. But in this book it turns out that it is okay for people to be idolized, if that person's name is Maggie and she's a good person, theoretically. At the end of the book, as I mentioned in the plot summary, all of the negs who have been freed head to Maggie's farm and hold a vigil for her. And when she emerges, they start crying and are desperate to get to her and, I don't know, touch the hand of a goddess or something? They even start singing Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace. Yeah. Seriously, it's insane. This is explained as being because of Gus's documentary, but first, that seems potentially unrealistic, and second, Gus's documentary was also weirdly obsessed with Maggie and how amazing she is and so on. It gives me major icks when a character is idolized, either by the story or by the other characters. I mean, that's literally why I had to stop reading The Hunger Games and stop watching Doctor Who. So yeah, it gives me major icks to see Maggie being idolized like this after being a terrible person, and after not even contributing that much to the revolution. There are far better people for negs to idolize than this random girl. For instance, Gus, who was integral to the revolution and ostensibly sacrificed himself for it. Alex, the public leader of pre-Evo, Liam, a neg who fought on regardless of setbacks, or even Quentin and Sebastian, who are theoretically saving M-Corp from being a bad company, or even Eliza, who sacrificed herself to take down M-Corp. Why Maggie, and why Maggie alone? It's very weird, and it reeks of main character syndrome. Yeah, she is the main character, but still. The only reason I didn't quit from reading something so main character as this is because it was literally right at the end of the book, so it didn't have much time to actually become annoying enough to put the book down. Alright, let's talk reviews. The reviews for Corruption don't seem to misunderstand the book quite so much as the reviews for Disruption, and certainly not as much as the reviews for Fathom Folk. But I still think it's interesting to discuss. At time of writing, there were 2,312 ratings for Corruption, with 312 reviews. 45% or 1,052 ratings were 5 stars, 798 or 34% were 4 stars, 378 or 16% were 3 stars, 59 or 2% were 2 stars, and 25 or 1% were 1 star, for an average rating of 4.21 stars. The oldest review from after publication is from November 3rd, 2014, and reads, quote, "Amazing Jessica Shervington book as always," with 5 stars. The most recent review is from January 2nd, 2025, and is just a 4.5 star review with no other text. Most positive reviews talk about liking the ending outside of Gus dying, liking the action, the romance, the funny dialogue, and the relationships between the characters, especially, of course, Quentin and Maggie. I know this is a romance, so like Quentin is one of the big appeals, but he really is a fan favourite, and for good reason. I've talked pretty extensively about how he's the most interesting and well-rounded character in the duology, and how he's nicely men written by women in terms of emotional sensitivity, a lack of toxic masculinity, and so on. I mean, he's the best character by design, but still. There's also this review from 2014 which was updated in 2019 and then again in 2021 saying it still hurts. And like, yeah, as someone who read this book in 2014, I get it. Negative reviews talked about how the book, especially the last section, dragged, which I agree with. This book had, in my opinion, far worse pacing than the last, and considering it just had less happening to begin with, it was odd. Also, the final battle sequence thing takes up like a third of the book. I majorly condensed it for my retelling. It just seems excessively long for no reason. Considering this book doesn't have the same romantic and psychological tension and lacks the mystery and emotional stakes of the last one, no matter how hard it tries, yeah, it's far weaker and less interesting. Not worth 1 star in my opinion. I mean, I gave it 3, but still, I can see where these people are coming from. Other negative reviews talked about the same miscommunication issues between the two main characters that I mentioned not liking, the characters being melodramatic and the dystopian setting being meh. I thought this comment about Maggie saving the world with 2 years experience at 18 odd, because yeah, it's unrealistic, but it's also the entire point of YA dystopians, so I don't really know what you expected. But I do agree with the comment about how it's insane how she could do so much while in hiding. There are other reviews still complaining about the science in the second book, which, yeah, it's botched, but again, that's a YA dystopian thing. There's also one 1-star review that just reads, "Yikes." Like, yikes what? I want to know! Next, I found this review which misspells Maggie's name the whole way through, and which claims that Gus seems to be going against Shervington's desires. Like, what? I can only assume they're talking about the Gus-Maggie kiss scene and aftermath, but that doesn't really include anything out of character from Gus, and it also isn't really a scene that shouldn't have existed as much as it is a contrived scene. The only reason I can think of that this scene would make people uncomfortable outside of the obvious that, you know, they get caught by Quentin, is that Gus is 23 and Maggie is 18, but I don't think that's what the review is getting at. Also, they criticise how little trauma Maggie seems to be carrying after her torture, which I suppose I can understand, but it does continue through a good chunk of the book. And also, like, was Maggie supposed to keep talking about food and darkness in every single scene to seem traumatized? She has things to do. I can only assume that this person must also have missed the part at the end of the book where one of the first things Maggie does after waking up after the final battle is ask Quentin to move her above ground, since she's so traumatized in terms of being underground. So yeah, perhaps a lack of observation? I don't know. For this book, we have yet more reviews that seem to have misunderstood 1, Maggie's entire character, and 2, the fact that this book is a romance primarily. In fact, lots of people seem to have been really turned off by the romance and relationship dramas in this book, which makes me wonder, like, didn't you see this coming? Even as an 11-year-old, I knew this was a romance book and would have lots of romance. I don't know how people misunderstood this. I mean, the blurb is so Quentin, 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 that it's obvious it's a romance if nothing else. But then, oddly enough, there's a different review which says the book is too much fighting and not enough love. Like, did we read the same book? Yeah, so like I said, the reviews for Corruption had a far better understanding of what to expect from the book, and a far better understanding of what was being communicated than with the reviews for Disruption. And that probably has a lot to do with the fact that people who misunderstood Disruption and didn't like it because of that probably didn't read Corruption. That said though, I still think people who didn't like the book, from looking at their reasons, would have benefited from 1, increasing their suspension of disbelief a bit, especially considering it's a YA romance dystopian, and 2, considering the genre meet it on its own terms. Honestly, since I started meeting books on their own terms, I've enjoyed reading a lot more, and have read more books from a wider variety of genres, and have also DNF'd far fewer books. It's made my reading life easier, so although I in no way want to insult the people writing negative reviews, or to suggest that their opinions and experiences of the book were in any way invalid, I do want to encourage them and anyone watching this video to, well, consider meeting books on their own terms. Disruption and Corruption were never going to be classic level literature. They're fun and slightly silly quick reads with a bit of everything. A bit of action, a bit of romance, a bit of death, a bit of a message, and so on. So with that said, let's wrap up this episode. Back in ye old year of 2014, for my birthday, I received a book that I was initially suspicious of, but quickly became obsessed with. And once I finished Disruption, I read Corruption in about a day. Having left them to rot on my bookshelf for probably 10 years, and being unable to get rid of them out of nostalgia, I decided to reread them. And considering how apprehensive I was about them being YA dystopian romances, they, or at least Disruption, pleasantly surprised me. Sure, they're far from being amazing literature, but they're a good and fun read if you don't take them too seriously. And I noticed that they discuss, or at least mention, several real and important themes in society, like class discrepancies and how eugenics are bad. Duh. And honestly, that's something that can't be said for many YA romances and many YA dystopians, so good on Jessica Shervington, I guess. In this video, I've taken you on the wild ride of these two books and have also discussed the good and the bad of them. Although they do have much more to say than most YA dystopian romances, that doesn't mean they actually say much or execute those themes well. Also, the Holocaust allegory is poorly done, and Maggie hating on other girls is an annoying feature of the time they came out in. Probably my favourite thing about the two books is the insane psychological manipulation Maggie uses on Quentin in the first book. Having matured and seen the detail of how horrible she is just horrifyingly fascinating, and really kept me hooked even though I knew how the book ended. In the end, they're pretty fine. They're good light reading, I guess. After having made this video, I reckon I'll give Disruption a 3.5 star rating and Corruption a 2.5, since it's just nowhere near as strong or polished as the first book, possibly because it just seems to have been rushed out. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed some different content on my channel and learning about an Australian series with an Australian take on America, considering, well, most of my viewers are from America. And, you know, I don't think I've ever seen a YA dystopian novel that isn't American or maybe British. Do I plan to become a book review channel? No, not really, since it was kind of a bore to make this video. But if you do like this kind of content, let me know, I guess. I wanted to preserve these books on the internet and do indeed want to discuss more examples of people who didn't critically read a book and thus hated it. Ahem. Fathom folk. Ahem. You know, I discuss critical thinking a lot, and critical thinking issues certainly aren't limited to K-pop. So that brings us to the end of this video. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.